Imagine, if you will, a quiet evening in a town nestled between the great winding rivers of Mesopotamia. The air is cooling after the long heat of the day, and a faint glow lingers on the horizon, where the last light of the sun has slipped away. In the streets, the clay bricks of homes still hold a little warmth, releasing it gently into the night. Lanterns, dim and smoky, flicker at doorways, their flames bending with the soft movement of the air. The fragrance of earth, darkened and damp from irrigation channels, rises faintly, mingling with the smoke of hearth fires that burn low in courtyards. The sound of water carries across the distance, steady and unhurried, a reminder of how deeply life here depended on the patient rhythm of the rivers. Step inside one of these modestums, and you might see a clay hearth glowing with embers. A pot rests near it, holding the remains of a simpler meal of barley or lentils, now cooling slowly. Shadows gather at the edges of the room, soft and heavy, while voices murmur low and gentle. Perhaps a child curls near the fire, drowsy from the day's labor in the fields, or from helping gather reeds along the canals. The household is not bustling with urgency, but moving instead at Arkham pace, where tasks are repeated with a sense of quiet inevitability. Here, life is measured not in moments of sudden change, but in patterns that return again and again: the planting, the harvest, the weaving, and the mending. Among these patterns of daily life, one of the most humble and steady crafts was the weaving of sandals. To the modern eye, sandals may seem ordinary, almost unremarkable, yet in ancient Mesopotamia, they were shaped with care and skill, woven from reeds pulled from the marshes, from palm fibers stripped and dried, or from softened leather stretched and cut. They were objects of pure necessity, born from the landscape itself, carrying people across muddy fields, dusty roads, and warm sun-baked courtyards. Every step in this ancient land was cushioned by the handiwork of sandals, as essential as the clay pots that held water or the baskets that carried grain. When we think of Mesopotamia, it is easy to picture towering ziggurats, bustling marketplaces, or intricate tablets pressed with cuneiform. Yet beneath those grand achievements was a quieter story, the story of simple objects, of daily rituals, of ordinary things woven into the rhythm of survival. Sandals belonged to this quieter story. They were not monuments, nor were they treasures of kings, but they supported every journey, every errand, every return home at the end of a long day. Their making was not celebrated in grand inscriptions, but whispered across time through the patience of hands and the resilience of fibers. Imagine a courtyard as dusk turns to night. The family gathers in the open space within mud-brick walls, where breezes flow and stars begin to reveal themselves. A reed mat has been laid out, and on it rests a small pile of freshly cut reeds, their surface still cool from the water where they grew. Nearby, palm fronds are being stripped, their long fibers separated in tithan strands that will bend without breaking. A simple knife of sharpened copper lies ready, and beside it, azimuth stone used to flatten and press. A woman sits quietly, her hands steady, braiding fibers together with a practiced rhythm. The work is not rushed, for sandals are not born in haste. Each strand must be pulled taut, each knot pressed firmly, each sole layered thick enough to carry a person through fields and streets. The courtyard is filled with small sounds: the creak of fibers, the gentle sigh of breath, the rustle of palm strands against the mat. Perhaps a child sits close, watching, their eyes following the slow movements, learning not from words, but from. They may try their own hands at braiding, their work uneven and loose, but cherished nonetheless. In this way, knowledge passes quietly from one generation to the next, not by loud instruction, but by quiet observation, by being present in the rhythm of work. This is the world into which we step when we speak of sandals in Mesopotamia. It is not a world of battles or rulers, but of ordinary life lived step by step, day after day. The making of sandals carried with it an unspoken poetry, fibers drawn from riverbanks, transformed into protection for the feet, strands once rooted in earth, now guiding people across it. Each pair of sandals was both fragile and fragile in its materials, easily worn by time and terrain, yet strong in its purpose, carrying people across the seasons of their lives. As we drift gently through this story together, we will not hurry. Instead, we will linger on the textures of reeds between fingers, on the scent of drying fibers, on the soft press of silice against the ground. We will consider the courtyards where this craft was practiced, the tools that guided it, the markets where sandals were exchanged, and the paths they traveled. We will move through time as slowly as the rivers themselves, unhurried, steady, carrying memory in each bend and turn. So, lie back now, and breathe slow. Imagine the flicker of lantern light dancing across mud brick walls. Imagine the coolness of the night air drifting in from the canals, carrying with it the scent of water and soil. Imagine the quiet hum of voices, the touch of woven fibers, the soft impression of footsteps fading into dust. This is not a story of grandeur, but of gentleness, of sandals, humble and woven, that once carried the people of Mesopotamia through their ordinary, extraordinary lives. Let us begin our journey with them, calmly and carefully, step by step. It is early morning in Mesopotamia. The world is still quiet, resting in the soft pause between night and day. Theolite is gentle, pale gold spreading slowly across the horizon, touching the surface of the wide rivers with ashima that looks almost like silk. The Tigris and the Euphrates, those patient giants of water, move steadily through the land, carving their paths between fields and marshes. They have flowed this way for countless years, and they will continue long after this morning has passed. For the people who live here, the rivers are not on landmarks of the land, they are the lifelines of their very survival. The air is cool, almost damp, carrying with its faint sweetness of reeds that grow in thick stands along the banks. Birds stir in the branches of date palms, and their calls echo softly, carried far by the stillness of dawn. If you listen carefully, you can hear the splash of fish breaking the surface, and the rustling of tall grasses swaying with the breeze. In this gentle hour, before the heat of the day arrives, villagers walk barefoot into the shallow marshes to begin one of their most important tasks, gathering reeds. The reeds stand tall, green, and swaying, each stalk reaching upward as though chasing light. Their roots grip the wet soil firmly, nourished by the water that seeps steadily from the rivers. For generations, people have known these reeds intimately. They know which are strong enough to weave into mats, which are pliable enough to braid into baskets, and which are most suitable for sandals. The villagers step slowly through the shallows, their feet brushing against cool water and soft mud. The dew clings to the reeds, sparkling faintly in the morning light, and when the stalks are cut, the air fills with the scent of fresh greenery, earthy, sharp, and alive. There is no rush in their movements. Each reed is cut with simple tools, perhaps a flint bladia, a copper sickle, its edge dulled from years of use. The stalks are gathered into neat bundles, tied with strips of palm fiber, and lifted carefully onto shoulders. The work is steady and quiet, with pauses to breathe, to look around, to feel the soft breeze on skin. Children often follow their parents, stepping lightly through the marshes, laughing softly as they try to help. Their hands are smaller, their cuts uneven, but their presence brings warmth to the morning. In this way, knowledge is passed without ceremony, through the simple act of doing. As the sun rises higher, the reeds shine brighter, reflecting light in long, golden lines across the fields of water. Farther away, farmers are already tending to irrigation canals, checking that water flows evenly into the plots where barley and wheat will grow. The two activities, farming and gathering reeds, may seem different, but they are bound by the same rhythm, the cycle of water, soil, and patience. Every household depends on these resources. The grain feeds the body, and the reeds clothe the feet, shelter the home, and shape the tools of daily life. The bundles of reeds, once carried from the marshes, are brought back into villages built of mud brick walls. The houses are small but sturdy, their walls thick enough to keep cool during the day and warm at night. Thicket yards within these homes are shaded and open to the sky. It is here, in these quiet spaces, that the reeds will be laid out to dry. They are spread across mats, aligned neatly, so that the morning sun will draw out. The smell of drying reeds mingles with the aroma of bread baking in clay ovens, filling the air with a fragrance that is both simple and comforting. To imagine life in these villages is to imagine a pace that is steady and unhurried. Time is measured, not by hours and minutes, but by the sun's slow path, by the turning of the seasons, by the ripening of crops, and by the readiness of materials. Reeds must be cut at the right moment, neither too young nor too brittle. They must be softened, soaked, and dried with care. Patience is woven into every step. In this way, even the smallest acts, like gathering stalks along the river, become part of a larger story, one that connects earth, water and human need. The people themselves move with this rhythm. They wake with the dawn. They pause in the shade during the heat. They gather in the cool of evening. Their sandals, woven from the very reeds they harvest, carry them across the same paths each day down to the rivers, into the fields, across the courtyards, and back again. The sandals wear thin, but they are mended, rewoven, made new from these marshes where their fibers were first gathered. If we pause here, by the river's edge, we might sense how important this first step truly was. The gathering of reeds was not just a task, it was a ritual of connection. Each stalk tied into a bundle was a link between the land and the people, between survival and tradition. Without their reeds there would be no mats to sleep on, no baskets to store grain, and no sandals to protect the feet from hot, cracked soil. The reeds were everywhere, ordinary, overlooked, yet essential. They were the quiet gift of the rivers, renewed each season, as dependable as the rising sun. Emotionally, one might imagine how the people felt as they moved through these waters. Perhaps there was gratitude, unspoken but deeply felt, for the abundance provided by the rivers. Perhaps there was also a sense of fragility, a knowledge that without water their reeds would wither, and life itself would falter. In their gathering, there was both confidence and humility, a trust in the cycle of seasons, and an awareness of how small human effort is when compared with the great forces of nature. As the day moves on, the quiet marshes return to stillness. The bundles of reeds have been carried away, leaving only soft impressions of footsteps in the mud. The sun climbs higher, warming the land, drawing birds higher into the sky. Life continues in the village, but the memory of the morning remains calm, purposeful, full of the gentle labor that sustains life. When we reflect on the weaving of sandals, it is easy to focus on the finished object, the soles braided thick, the straps tied firm, the protection they offered against stone and heat. But to truly understand them, we must return here, to the riverside. For every sandal began not in the hands of a weaver, but in the quiet gathering of reeds at dawn. Without these first steps along the river, the story could not begin at all. So let us rest here for a while, listening to the steady murmur of water, watching the light move gently across the marsh. Let us imagine the reeds swaying with the breeze, their stalks catching the sun, their roots anchored in the nourishing soil. This is the starting point, the first breath of the craft, the soft moment where necessity and patience meet. From this stillness, the journey of weaving will unfold, slowly, gently, carrying us step by step into the lives of the people who once walked these lands. The path from the marshes back to the village was not long, but it was slow, winding gently along the edges of irrigation canals and dusty fields. Those who carried the freshly gathered reeds often walked barefoot, the dampness of the morning still clinging to their skin, the cool mud giving way to the warmth of packed earth beneath the sun. Over their shoulders lay the bundles, tied firmly with strips of palm fiber. The reeds were fragrant, earthy and green, releasing a sweetness that reminded one of the riverbanks where they had grown. With each step, the stalks shifted slightly, creaking against each other, whispering a sound that was part of the music of everyday life. The bundles were not heavy, but they were awkward, long stalks brushing against arms and legs as they swayed. The villagers moved steadily, pausing now and then to adjust the load, to greet a neighbor, or simply to look around at the fields stretching wide in every direction. Some paths were lined with date palms, tall and graceful, their fronds casting patterned shadows on the ground. These trees offered more wreath and shade. They were a second source of material, their fibrous leaves destined to be stripped and softened, twisted into strands, strong enough to hold together sandals, baskets, and roofs. To walk home with reeds on one side and palms on the other was to walk within the twin gifts of the land, both waiting to be shaped by patient hands. When the villagers reached their courtyards, the work shifted from gathering to preparing. Homes in Mesopotamia were often built close together, mud brick walls pressed side by side, their flat roofs sometimes connected, forming clusters of shelter that shared heat and shade. Within these walls lay open courtyards, space where the rhythm of family life unfolded. It was here that the reeds were laid down, carefully unbundled and spread in neat rows. Children often helped with this task, their small hands reaching eagerly for the stalks, arranging them clumsily at first but improving. With practice, the sight of reeds drying in the sun was a familiar one, as common as bread baking or water jars standing cool against a wall. Palm fronds, too, were brought into the courtyards. These leaves were tougher than reeds, fibrous and strong, and before they could be useful, they had to be stripped. Adults sat on low stools, pulling the long green fronds across simple blades, separating theatre leaf from the inner fiber. The sound was soft but steady, the scrape of leaf against tool. The faint tearing os fibers loosened. Piles grew slowly at their feet, strands coiling in small heaps, ready to be braided into cords. These fibers, though humble, were durable enough to hold together roofs and walls, yet pliant enough to tie sandals firmly across the foot. The preparation of these materials was not rushed. It unfolded in quiet companionship as family members worked side by side, their hands busy while their voices drifted easily into conversation. Children might soak reeds in shallow basins of water, pushing them down with their palms, watching bubbles rise as the stalks softened. The water darkened with use, carrying the green scent of plants, and when the reeds were lifted out, they bent more easily, ready to be woven into soles. There was satisfaction in this simple transformation, in taking something stiff and unyielding, and through patience, turning it into a material that could be shaped. As the day warmed, shade became precious. Courtyards were often built with awnings, afcloth, or reed mats, stretched above, casting soft patterns of light below. Here, families could continue their work without the harshness of the sun. The air smelled of drying reeds, damp clay, and bread baking in ovens nearby. The sounds of preparation blended with the gentle life of the village. Donkeys braying, chickens scratching, neighbors calling greetings across walls. It was a symphony of the ordinary, every note contributing to the stadium of survival. To prepare reeds and palm fronds was not merely a task of utility. It was a ritual woven into 30 of days and seasons. Each step, cutting, carrying, soaking, stripping, was repeated again and again, year after year, until it became a pattern almost as natural as breathing. Children grew up with these actions etched into their memory, so that by the time they were grown, their hands moved with the same assurance as their parents'. This continuity bound generations together, linking past to present through fibers and threads. There was also an emotional texture to these preparations. For the people of Mesopotamia, the reeds and palm fronds represented more than raw material. They were symbols of resilience, of the ability to draw life from the land, even in its harshest conditions. The rivers gave water, but the reeds gave form, structure, and the possibility of movement. The palms gave fruit for nourishment, shade for rest, and fibers for building. To prepare these materials was to engage in an act of gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement of the gifts that sustained them. Evenings brought a shift in atmosphere. When the heat of the day began to soften, families gathered once more in their The bundles of reeds now lay drying, their green fading slightly to yellow, their surfaces firming. Palm fibers, stripped and coiled, waited in baskets. Children grew drowsy from the day's tasks, their play slowing as shadows stretched long across the ground. The work of preparation had its own gentle ending, as slowing of pace as the sky turned from gold to violet. In the hush of dusk, as lanterns were lit and meals were shared, the day's quiet labor settled into memory. The next morning, the cycle would begin again. Some days were devoted to gathering new reeds, others to soaking, stripping, or braiding. The process was never complete, for life itself required constant replenishment. Sandals wore thin, mats frayed, baskets split under the weight of grain. Yet the people did not despair at this impermanence. Instead, they accepted it as part of the order of things, knowing that with every frayed strap or broken sole came the opportunity to begin again. In this way, their preparation of reeds and palm fronds was not just about objects, but about a philosophy of living and understanding that nothing lasted forever, yet everything could be renewed with patience. In time, the children who once splashed their hands in soaking basins would become the adults who guided the work. Their laughter rolled quiet into steady instruction, their play into practiced motion. And so the cycle would continue, without fanfare, without disruption, like the rivers themselves flowing steadily through the land. The bundles of reeds carried home along dusty paths, the palm fronds stripped in shaded courtyards, the soaking basins filled with cool water. All these small rituals would remain, shaping the daily life of Mesopotamia in ways both profound. The story of Sandals may seem to begin with weaving, with the act of creating soles and straps, but truly, it begins here, in the preparation, in the quiet work of families bending fibers to their will. Without bundles of reeds drying in the sun, without palm fibers coiled neatly at the edge of a courtyard, there could be no Sandals at all. This stage was invisible in grand histories, yet it was the foundation of everything that followed, and perhaps, in the gentle rhythm of soaking and stripping, in the fragrance of drying reeds, there was a piece of that has echoed across time an ancient calm that still lingers in the fragments we uncover today. As night descended again, lanterns flickering, in the courtyards, the day's labor faded into rest. The bundles leaned at gainstools, waiting for tomorrow. The air cooled, carrying the scent of earth and water. Families lay down to sleep, their feet bare, their sandals set aside. And somewhere, just beyond the walls, the reeds in the marshes, stood Talonsmore, swaying in the breeze, ready to begin the cycle again. In the heart of Mesopotamian homes, beyond the sturdy walls of mud brick that shielded families from heat and wind, lay the courtyard. These spaces were not hidden chambers, nor were they vast gardens. They were simple, open squares under the sky, surrounded by walls that created a quiet boundary between the private life of the household and the busy movement of the village beyond. It was here, in these calm, shaded spaces, that much of daily life unfolded. Cooking, resting, playing, and weaving all took place in the courtyard, and it was here, especially, that Sandals began to take form. The air in these courtyards carried its own texture, a mix of scents and sounds that marked the intimacy of home. The fragrance of clay walls warming in the sun mingled with the sharper smell of drying herbs tied in bundles and hung from wooden beams, rosemary, thyme, and mint wherein, only for cooking, but also for warding off insects and bringing freshness to the air. Smoke from small hearths drifted through, leaving a faint reminder of bread baked earlier in clay ovens. The floor was often pressed earth, cool underfoot, sprinkled occasionally with water to settle dust. Breezes slipped throataways, carrying the faint rustle of palms from outside. The sounds were subdued, the low murmur of familiar voices, the cluck of a chicken wandering through, the creak of fibers as they were drawn tight in careful hands. In these courtyards, weaving sandals was a patient art. There was no rush, for nothing about the work could be hurried. Women sat on low stools, their posture steady, hands moving with practiced rhythm. Strands of reed, palm fiber, or softened leather lay in neat piles beside them, sorted by thickness and length. With each movement, the strands were twisted, braided, pressed, and pulled into shape. The sound was gentle but distinct, the rasp of fiber against fiber, the occasional snap when a piece was drawn too tightly. The soft sigh of Agismentis the weaver rethreaded her work. Sometimes men joined in, especially when thicker leather straps needed to be cut, or when heavy swords were required, but much of the weaving was a shared domestic labor, done quietly within the family space. Children often lingered at the edges of the courtyard, their curiosity drawing them close. They would watch the slow movements, mimicking the gestures with small hands. Sometimes they were given scraps of reed to practice with, their braids uneven, their knots clumsy. These early attempts were part of their education, not in a formal sense, but in the natural way knowledge flowed in Mesopotamia, passed from generation to generation without need for written instruction. A child's laughter, mingled with the steady sound of braiding, gave the courtyard a rhythm that was both lively and calm. The sandals themselves took shape slowly, layer by layer. First the soles braided from reeds, softened in water until pliant enough to bend without. Each braid was wound and pressed flat. The layers tightened with careful pressure so that they would withstand long days of walking. When the base was secure, straps were prepared, sometimes thin cords of palm fiber, twisted tightly until they were strong and smooth. Other times, strips of leather cut and softened with oil. These straps were threaded through holes pierced with simple awls, tied across the sole in patterns that would hold the sandals snugly to the foot. Nothing ornate was required. The beauty lay in the simplicity, in the way function shaped form. Time in the courtyard seemed to stretch unhurried. A morning might pass with only a few pairs completed, but no one measured the work by speed. Instead, it was measured by care, by the evenness of braids, the firmness of the knots, the comfort of the final fit. Each sandal was both ordinary and essential, destined to tread dusty paths, muddy canal banks, or the smooth stone of temple courtyards. Yet, in their ordinariness, they carried the quiet dignity of necessity. The courtyard was more than a place of labor. It was a place of connection. As hands worked, voices shared stories. Elders recalled past seasons, floods and droughts, harvests both lean and abundant. Mothers taught daughters not only the techniques of weaving, but also the patience required to complete them. Fathers, returning from the fields, might sit nearby, mending tools or shaping wood, their presence adding to the steady hum of domestic life. Neighbors passing by could hear the rhythm of this work through open doorways, a sound so familiar it blended seamlessly into the life of the village. Emotionally, the courtyard carried a sense of safety. Within its walls, one was shielded from the demands of the outside world. The weaving of sandals became almost meditative, a task that required attention but not anxiety, that invited focus without strain. In the repetition of pulling, braiding, and tying, there was a calm that soothed its mind, a reminder that survival was built not on sudden achievements but on small, steady acts. The sandals born here were not just for walking, they were for carrying the family into the next day, into the next season, into the next season, into the continuation of life itself. Even the materials carried echoes of the land. The reeds, once rooted in marshes, now bent and twisted into soles, reminded the people of the rivers that nourished them. The palm fibers, on sleeves stretching toward the sky, now wrapped around feet, reminded them of the trees that shaded and fed them. Each pair of sandals was a link between the natural world and human need, a small bridge connecting them fields and groves to the daily paths of ordinary lives. As the day wore on, the light in the courtyard shifted. Morning brightness gave way to the harsher glare of noon. When shadows shrank and the air grew heavy, weaving continued in the shade. Slower now, with pauses for water or a simple meal of bread and dates. Their Sandals rested in small stacks near the walls, their greenish fibers drying, their shapes firming under the warmth of the day. By afternoon, the pace slowed further, as hands tired and minds turned toward evening tasks. Animals were fed, jars of water were drawn from wells, fires were prepared for the evening meal. The sandals waited quietly, part of the background of home, yet ready to step into the world as soon as they were needed. As the sun lowered and the courtyard cooled again, the space filled with softer sounds. Families gathered, children play, neighbors might visit briefly. The sandals, finished or half-made, became part of the scenery, lying quietly where they had been worked on throughout the day. They were not treasures to be displayed, but tools Tob used, and yet they carried with them the hours of patience and the presence of hands that shaped them. Each one bore the unseen imprint of family life, the laughter of children nearby, the murmur of conversation, the faint scent of bread rising from the oven. When darkness came, lanterns glowed softly in the courtyard, their flames small and steady. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the air cooled at last. The sandals, now completed, were placed near doorways or hung on wooden pegs, ready for use at dawn. The courtyard fell quiet, filled only with the occasional call of a night bird or the sigh of wind over rooftops. Families lay down to rest, their feet bare, the sandals waiting for another day of journeys across fields, paths, and markets. In this way, the courtyard was both workshop and sanctuary. It was the place where raw materials became objects of use, where reeds and palm fibers were transformed into the sandals that carried people through their lives. It was also the place where families found rhythm, where patience was learned, where stories and skills were passed gently from one generation to the next. The weaving of sandals in courtyards was not just about making shoes, it was about creating continuity, about shaping time into something tangible, about giving ordinary life a quiet foundation. If we close our eyes and imagine ourselves there, we can almost feel the texture of the pressed earth underfoot, smell the mingling sense of clay, herbs, and drying reeds, hear the faint rasp of fibers drawn tight. We can see the patient hands at work, the steady progress of sandals taking form, the gentle presence of family gathered nearby. It is a scene of simplicity, yet it holds within it the entire rhythm of Mesopotamian life. When we think of tools today, our minds may drift toward objects of gleaming metal, complex in design and crafted with precision. But in ancient Mesopotamia, the tools of daily life, especially those used for weaving sandals, were simple companions. They were not made to impress, nor were they symbols of wealth or status. They were humble, practical, and enduring. In their simplicity lay their beauty, and in their constant presence lay their companionship. for the weaver in her courtyard, or the craftsman in a shaded corner of his home. Thistles were steady friends, always at hand, always ready, carrying within them the memory of countless hours of. The sharp flint was perhaps the most ancient of these companions. Even as copper and bronze began to appear in the wider world, flints remained common, found along riverbanks and shaped by careful hands into blades. They were small and unassuming, chipped until their edges were fine enough to slice through reed or fiber. A flint blade was cool to the touch, fitting neatly into the palm, its edges sharp but fragile. Over time, the blade grew dull, and so it was reshaped, chipped again to reveal new edges. Each reshaping carried the story of its use: the sandals it had cut, the fibers it had trimmed, the hours it had shared in the courtyard. Flint was a reminder of continuity, of how something so simple could serve for years without losing its purpose. Alongside of flaunts, small copper blades came into use, offering a smoother cut and longer durability. Copper was not abundant, and its presence in a household marked both effort and care. To own a copper blade was not a matter of wealth alone, but of choice, a decision to invest in a tool that could serve faithfully, that could be sharp and agile, and again, that would not shatter under pressure. The copper blade glinted faintly in the light, its surface showing marks of sharpening stones, its handle often wrapped in fiber or leather for a firmer grip. Though humble, it carried a sense of reliability, a steady presence in the quiet rhythm of weaving. Not all tools were sharp. Some were smooth and rounded, chosen not to cut but to press. Pebbles, gathered from the banks of rivers or streams, were polished by water long before they reached human hands. Their surfaces were smooth, cool, and pleasing to hold. In the courtyard, these pebbles pressed fibers flat, smoothing the braids so they lay even, shaping soles so they held firm. A pebble was a tool that asked little and gave much, its usefulness lying not in its transformation by human hands but in its natural perfection. Each pebble was unique, some small enough to be held between two fingers, others broad enough to rest in the palm. They were often kept for years, their familiarity comforting, their weight steady, their surface warming slowly as they passed from hand to hand. Thenther was the awl, simple yet indispensable, fashioned from bone, wood, or later from metal. The awl pierced holes through leather or thick braids of fiber. Its point was sharp, its handle smooth, worn by the grip of countless fingers. The awl's task was never hurried. It moved with the slow rhythm of weaving, preparing the way for straps to pass through, guiding the sandal toward its final form. To hold an awl was to touch the work of those who came before, for awls were often handed down, their handles darkened by years of use. They were tools that bore the imprint of time, not in their breaking, but in their endurance. Together, these tools, flints, blades, pebbles, and awls, formed the quiet companions of sandal making. They were not displayed on walls, nor stored in chests of pride. They rested instead in baskets, in corners of courtyards, on shelves beside jars of grain. They were part of the fabric of daily life, touched as often as food bowls or water jars. Their presence, so constant, it was almost unnoticed. And yet, each tool carried weight, not the weight of metal or stone, but through it of memory, of familiarity, of being held by hands that shaped the world one small task at a time. The bond between maker and tool was not one of possession alone. It was a relationship built over years, where each movement reinforced trust. The flint knew the pressure of the hand, the pebble knew the rhythm of the palm, Thiel knew the angle of the wrist. To use these tools was not simply to wield them, but to converse with them, to feel their response, to let their weight and balance guide the hand. In this way, tools became more than objects. They became companions, partners in the act of creation. Generations deepened this bond. A flint blade used by Amatha might be passed to her daughter, its edges reshaped, yet still carrying the memory of past work. A pebble, smooth and familiar, might sit for decades in the same courtyard, touched by grandparents, parents, and Shlanolik. An awl, carefully kept, might see the rise and fall of families, its handle smoothed by hands long gone, yet ready to serve. These tools linked the present with the past, creating a quiet continuity that stretched. In the evenings, when work slowed and lanterns flickered in the courtyards, these tools often rested beside sandals they had helped shape. Their presence was unremarkable, yet comforting, like the steady glow of firelight or the soft murmur of water outside the walls. To see them lying there was to be reminded that life was built not only on great events, but on small, repeated acts, carried out with the help of simple companions. The emotional weight of these tools was subtle but deep. They represented patience, endurance, and trust in small things. They reminded families that survival did not require grandeur, but steadiness. Each cut, each press, each pressing was part of a larger rhythm, part of the slow weaving of life itself. The sandals created with their help were destined to wear down, to be replaced, to vanish into dust. But the tools remained, carrying forward the memory of every pair, every hand, every courtyard where they had been used. If we close our eyes, we can imagine them. A flint blade resting on a wooden stool, its edge chipped but still sharp. A copper blade gleaming faintly in the lantern light. A pebble lying warm from the press of a hand, and all standing ready, its point catching a glint of fire. Around them, the courtyard quiets. Families gather for the evening meal, and the tools wait patiently for another day of work. They do not clamor for attention, nor do they shine with wealth. They simply endure. Companions. 2 lives lived in rhythm, companions to the weaving of sandals that carried Mesopotamians across their world. And perhaps, in this endurance, we can glimpse something of our own lives. For even now, in our world of machines and dazzling devices, we too rely on simple companions. Objects worn smooth by use, familiar to the hand, steady in their presence. A favorite pen, a wooden spoon, a well-used brush, each carries echoes of those ancient tools. Each reminds us that creation begins not with grandeur, but with small acts, repeated patiently over time. So, when we pictured those Mesopotamian courtyards, shaded and quiet, let us also picture the tools that filled them. Not grand treasures, but humble objects, resting in baskets, lying on stools, waiting in silence. Their edges may be dull or sharp, their surfaces smooth or rough, but their presence is steady. They were, and are, companions in the journey of making, reminders that life is shaped not only by human hands, but also by the quiet tools that serve them. The making of a sandal began from the ground upward, and so, the first task was always the sole, for it was the foundation upon which every other part would rest. In Mesopotamia, where the earth could burn with heat beneath the midday sun or grow soft and muddy after the flooding of rivers, a strong sole was essential to protect the foot, to carry the body, to endure long days of walking. The sole needed both firmness and flexibility, and this was achieved not through complex tools or distant trades, but through braiding, the slow, deliberate tinting of reeds softened in water until they bent like threads in the hand. The braiding of soles was not a hurried act. It required patience, for each strand had to be placed with care, pressed into its neighbors so no gaps remained, pulled just tight enough to hold, but not so tightly as to snap. In the quiet courtyards of Mesopotamian homes, this task unfolded like a slow dance. Women sat low to the ground, a bundle of reeds beside them, a half-formed sole resting across their knees. They bent forward slightly, fingers working rhythmically, choosing one arid, twisting it gently, guiding it across another, pressing, smoothing, and then choosing the next. The world outside might be busy with markets, fields, and canals, but here, the rhythm was steady, almost meditative. To begin a sole, the first reeds were often braided into a thick cord. This cord became the spine of the sandal, its first spiral. Wound tightly in a circle, the cord formed the center of the sole. Around this center, more reeds were added, layer after layer, each pressed firmly against the last. As the spiral widened, it took on the shape of a foot, rounded at the heel, broader at the ball, narrowing toward the toes. Nothing was rushed. A single sole might take hours to form, the weaver's hands guiding the fibers with quiet care. Her movements as much about patience as about craft. The reeds, soaked beforehand in shallow basins of water, were cool and pliant in the fingers. Their surfaces glistened faintly, smooth but fibrous, carrying the fresh scent of the riverbanks where they had grown. As the work continued, the fibers dried slowly, firming into place, locking themselves into the spiral with a strength born of tension and compression. The sole thickened, its layers pressing together, becoming a shield between the tender flesh of the foot and the rough earth below. Each movement of the braid was familiar, repeated countless times across generations. Mothers had taught daughters, who in turn would one day teach their own children. The act of braiding was not written in books, nor was it recorded in stone. It lived in the hands, in the memory of touch, in the quiet inheritance of domestic life. To watch a pair of hands at work was to see centuries of memory unfolding, each strand a continuation of what had been done long before. The finished sole was never stiff like stone. It had to bend, to move with the foot, to flex as the wearer stepped across uneven ground, and so the braid was balanced between tightness and looseness, between strength and give. Too tight, and the sole would crack. Too loose, and it would unravel. The weaver's task was to find that balance, not by measuring or calculating, but by feel. Her fingers told her what was needed, the slight resistance of a reed pulled taut, the soft creak as fibers settled into place, the smoothness when layers lay flat. The sound of braiding filled the courtyard in gentle notes. There was the soft rustle of reeds sliding across each other, the faint crackle when a strand bent, the quiet exhale of the weaver as she leaned forward, focused but calm. Sometimes the crick of a stool joined in, or the flutter of a bird overhead, but mostly it was the sound of weaving itself that marked hours. This sound was not loud or insistent, but steady, a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the household. As souls grew in size, they carried with them the weight of time. Each braid was a mark of minute sparsing, each layer a quiet testament to labor. By the time a soul was complete, it held not only reeds and fibers but also the hours of concentration, the patience of hands repeating the same small gestures again and again. To look at such a soul was to see more than material. It was to see time itself, shaped into something tangible. Sandals, once finished, would be worn across fields, along riverbanks, through temple courtyards, but before they reached those places, they existed in their first form as braided soles, simple yet essential. Without them, no sandal could endure. The braiding of soles was, in a sense, the heart of sandal making, the step that gave purpose to every other. Sometimes, soles were reinforced. A second layer of braiding might be added beneath, creating greater thickness for those who walked long distances or carried heavy loads. In some cases, leather scraps were sewn or pierced onto the base, giving extra protection against sharp stones. But even with these additions, the foundation was always reeds, always the braided spiral that began in quiet courtyards with the simplest of tools. The making of soles was also a social act. In many homes, more than one person worked together. One might braid the cords, another might press them flat with a pebble, smoothing the surface, while yet another prepared reeds in water, ensuring a steady supply. Children often sat nearby, watching intently, learning not through words but through imitation. Their small fingers tried to copy the movements, their braids uneven but proud. The courtyard, filled with these small acts, became a classroom without walls, where skills were not taught but absorbed, woven into the fabric of daily life. Emotionally, the soles carried meaning as well. To give someone sandals was to give them protection, comfort, and the ability to travel safely. A pair of soles braided with care might last through seasons of work and harvest, carrying their owner across miles of its. Each sole was more than material, it was a quiet promise that the body would be shielded. That journey would continue. That feet would not be left bare to the unforgiving earth. In this way, the braiding of soles was practical and symbolic, a small act of love and care within the household. The rhythm of braiding often aligned with the rhythm of life itself. Soles were made as the seasons passed, as fields were planted, as canals were cleared, as harvests were gathered. They were made in times of abundance and in times of want, in homes filled with laughter and in homes marked by silence. Always, the braiding continued, steady and unchanging. A reminder that survival depended not on moments of grandeur, but on small, repeated tasks done faithfully. As the day turned to evening, soles in various stages of completion often lay scattered across the courtyard. Some were small meant for children, their spirals tight and neat. Others were large, broad enough for adult men, their layers thicker, their shapes more substantial. Each one reflected its maker's care, each one slightly different, for no were ever identical. And yet, in their differences, they shared a unity of purpose: to protect, to endure, to carry. When lanterns were lit and shadows stretched across the walls, the soles rested quietly, drying in the cool night air. Their surfaces, once damp from soaking reeds, grew firm, their spirals holding steady. The weaver's hands, tired but calm, lay folded in her lap, her day's work done. Around her, family gathered, voices soft, the courtyard filled with the smell of evening meals. The souls, though silent, bore witness to all of this. Their presence, a reminder of the hours just passed, of the patience just practiced. In this way, the braiding of souls was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because it happened every day, in countless courtyards, by countless hands. Extraordinary, because it was the quiet foundation of life, the unseen labor that allowed journeys to be made, work to be done, worship to be carried out. Without souls, feet would burn on hot earth, would cut on sharp stones, would falter in mud. With souls, people walked steadily, carrying with them the memory of the courtyard where their sandals began. If we pause for a moment and imagine, we can almost feel it ourselves, the texture of reeds between fingers, the pressure of braids pressed flat, the soft creak as fibers tighten. We can hear the quiet sounds of work, the steady rhythm of weaving, the background murmur of family life. We can see the souls forming slowly, their spirals widening, their shapes emerging, each one carrying with it the hours, Afcom labor, that gave it birth. And perhaps, in that imagining, we can feel what the people of Mesopotamia must have felt. That life, at its heart, is woven not from grand events, but from countless small acts of patience. The braiding of souls was one such act, repeated over and over, across years and generations, shaping not only sandals but also the rhythm of life itself. The sandal, though humble in form, was never complete with its sole alone. The sole provided strength and protection, but it was the straps that bound it to the body, that allowed it to move as one with the foot. Without straps, the sandal was a flat braid of reeds, destined to fall away at the first step. With straps, it became a companion to the traveler, a partner in daily life. And so, in Mesopotamian courtyards, as the souls dried in shade, attention turned next to the making of straps-in cords of red or strips of leather, prepared with patient care, smoothed and twisted until they could embrace the foot with gentle snugness. The making of straps was a quieter task than the braiding of souls, where souls required long cords and spirals. Straps asked only for lengths of material, twisted or cut with precision. Yet this smaller work carried its own kind of patience, for the strap wool touched the skin directly. It had to be smooth, never rough, lest it rubbed the foot raw. The weaver's fingers moved carefully, smoothing each reed with water, twisting it until it lay flat, or rubbing leather with oil until it softened to the touch. A bowl of sesame or animal fat might sit nearby, the oil glistening as it was worked into leather strips, leaving them supple, darkened, and ready to bend without cracking. Reeds, too, could serve as straps, though they required skill. Thin reeds were split into narrow strands, then braided together until they formed cords strong enough to hold. Their surfaces, once fibrous and sharp, were softened by soaking their edge, pressed until smooth. The cords were light, almost airy compared to leather, yet they held firmly weighted. To look at them was to see simplicity. To hold them was to feel strength disguised within delicacy. Some families preferred reed straps for their lightness in summer, when the heat pressed down and every layer of clothing felt heavy. Others favored leather, especially for long walks or work in the fields, where sturdiness was prized. When the straps were ready, they were placed across the sole in patterns both practical and graceful. The simplest design was a loop across the toes, another around the heel, joined by cords that circled the ankle. Their foot slipped easily into this embrace, held firm but not constricted. Other designs wove the straps diagonally, crossing the top of the foot in quiet patterns that echoed the braids of the sole itself. None were ornate in thescence of decoration, but all carried elegance in their symmetry, in the way they fitted naturally to the shape of Thebede. The beauty of Mesopotamian sandals was not in excess, but in harmony, the harmony between foot and strap, between strength and gentleness. Each strap was pierced into place with care. Awls, simple but sharp, made small holes in the braided sole. Through these holes, straps were threaded and tied, their knots pulled tight, their ends smoothed flat. The act of piercing was deliberate, for every hole weakened the braid slightly. Too many holes, and the sole might split. Too few, and the straps might slip. The weaver's judgment guided Thebulance, her hand steady as she pressed the awl, her eye tracing the natural line of the foot. With each placement, the sandal grew closer to completion, its form emerging not suddenly but gradually, like dawn breaking softly over the horizon. In the courtyard, this stage of work often drew the family closer. Children, curious and eager, leaned in to watch the threading of straps, their eyes following the movements intently. They reached out, sometimes, to touch the cords, to feel the smooth leather or the braided reeds. The maker allowed them small roles, holding a strap taut while it was threaded, smoothing a knot after it was tied. These small acts bound children not only to the work, but to the rhythm of tradition. By touching the straps, they touched the same labor their grandparents had once touched, the same care that linked generations together through quiet craft. Emotion lingered in the making of straps, for they were the parts of the sandal most closely tied to the body. To tie straps was to imagine the foot they would hold, the journeys they would endure, the comfort they must provide. Apparent weaving. Straps for a child might think of the paths ahead, the walk to markets, the run through fields, their steps toward adulthood. A wife preparing straps for her husband might imagine him in the fields, steady on hot earth, his feet protected by her care. The straps, though small, carried love within them, woven into their firmness and their fit. The hours of this work were unhurried. Straps were twisted, braided, smoothed, pierced, and tied with the same patience that marked all of Mesopotamian life. There was no hurry, for sandals were not luxuries but necessities, and necessities were made with steadiness. The courtyard filled with soft sounds, the creak of reeds under tension, the faint scrape of an all-through braid, the rustle as cords were pulled taut. These sounds mingled with the everyday music of home. A child's laughter, the call of a bird, the bubbling of a pot on the hearth. In this harmony, the straps took their place, not as isolated objects, but as parts of life's larger rhythm. When completed, the straps gave sandals their quiet elegance. They were not adorned with gems or dyes. Times, a strip of leather might carry faint lines pressed into it, marks of the knife or the texture of the palm that had smoothed it. These marks were not decoration in the sense of art, but the natural signatures of craft. Such straps was to carry with you the touch of the maker, the echo of her patience, the calm of the courtyard where the sandal had been born. Straps also spoke of resilience. They were small, and yet they bore the strain of every step. They stretched and pulled, absorbed the tension of walking, and held firm against the demands of daily life. They were reminders that strength does not always lie in size or grandeur, but in a strap no wider than a finger could carry a body across fields, through marshes, and along stone paths, holding without breaking. In this way, they mirrored the lives of those who made them, lives that were humble, ordinary, but steady enough to endure. At the close of the day, sandals with freshly tied straps often rested by the courtyard wall, drying in the last light of the sun. Their soles were firm, their straps ready, their forms complete. Families gathered around them, not with ceremony, but with the simple knowledge that tomorrow they would be worn, that tomorrow they would serve. A child might slip a foot into a new pair, testing snugness, wriggling toes against the braid. A parent might adjust the straps, nodding in satisfaction. These quiet moments gave meaning to the labor, for the straps were not abstract, they were tangible care, fitted directly to the needs of the body. As night fell, the sandals waited in silence, their straps holding gently, their forms resting in peace. Lantern light flickered across them, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Their straps, though, still carried the memory of hands that had twisted and smoothed them, of fingers that had tied knots with patient care. In their stillness, they seemed to embody the calm of the day's work, the serenity of tasks completed without haste. And so, the making of straps was not only a craft, but a lesson. It showed that strength could be found in small things, that care could be expressed through simple acts, that elegance lay not in decoration but in harmony. The straps across the foot were the final embrace of the sandal, the bond between human and earth, the quiet link that allowed journeys to unfold. In their presence, we glimpsed the essence of Mesopotamian life, humble, patient, enduring, and full of quiet grace. If we close our eyes now, we can imagine the feel of those straps, the smooth leather, warmed by oil and hand, the braided reeds, cool and firm, the gentle snugness as they crossed the foot, neither too loose nor too tight. We can see the courtyard, where they were made, the family gathered, the tools resting, the lantern flickering. We can hear the soft sounds of weaving, the murmur of voices, the sigh of evening air, and in that imagining, we too become part of the scene, part of the tradition of patient craft that shaped sandals for countless generations. The sandals of Mesopotamia were never fixed in a single form. They were not made once and forever, but instead followed the rhythm of the seasons, shifting gently with the turning of the year. In the hot months, when the ground baked beneath the sun and the air shimmered with heat, sandals were light, their soles thin, their straps airy. In the cooler seasons, when winds grew sharp and nights longer, soles thickened, and coverings of leather were added to keep out the chill. The craft of sandal making, like farming and cooking, was never static. It was alive, responding quietly to the demands of weather, earth, and sky. To understand Mesopotamian sandals, then, is to walk through the seasons alongside them, feeling the subtle ways in which life adapted to each turn of the year. Summer was the season when sandals were most essential. The Mesopotamian plain, wide and open, received sunlight without mercy. The soil, cracked and pale underfoot, grew so hot by midday that bare skin could scarcely touch it without pain. To walk unprotected was to risk blisters and burns, and so sandals became not only practical but necessary. In these months, soles were braided to be firm, yet not overly thick, allowing the foot to breathe while keeping the skin away from the searing ground. Straps, often made of reeds rather than heavy leather, were chosen for their lightness, their coolness against the skin. Many were tied loosely, so air could flow freely, carrying away the sweat of the day. To see a courtyard in summer was to see sandals drying along the wall, their shapes simple but effective, waiting for the morning's work. The summer sandal was more than a tool. It was a kind of shield against the heat, a quiet promise of comfort in a season when comfort was. Farmers wore them into the fields, their feet stepping carefully among rows of grain, the sandals bearing the weight of long hours under the sun. Traders walked dusty roads with them, carrying goods toward markets, the soles protecting against stones and heated earth. Children ran through courtyards in theirs, laughing, their feet kept safe even as they played beneath the unrelenting sky. All these lives were bound together by the simple design of the summer sandal, a design shaped less by fashion than by the demands of the season itself. When the year turned and cooler winds arrived, sandals shifted to them in the late autumn. As nights grew long and the air carried a sharp edge, soles were thickened, more layers of reed were braided, or strips of leather were pressed into the base. These changes made the sandals less flexible, but they gave protection from the cold ground. Sometimes pieces of cloth or wool were wrapped around the feet before sandals were tied, adding warmth in the absence of closed shoes. These layers were simple, drawn from what each household could spare, but together they created enough comfort to carry families through the chill. In these cooler months, sandals took on a new kind of meaning. They were not only protection against heat, but against the biting cold that crept in from thoroughfares and fields. The soles, once light, became heavier. The straps, once red, were often leather, rubbed with oil until soft. Where summer sandals had been airy, winter sandals were sturdy, their strength felt in every step. And yet, even as they grew heavier, they carried the same quiet beauty, the same harmony between form and need. They reflected the calm acceptance with which Mesopotamian families met the seasons, not with resistance, but with adaptation, crafting what was necessary and moving forward with patience. The harvest season brought its own demands. During these months, fields filled with stubble, sharp stalks cut low after grain had been gathered. The ground was littered with straw and husks, rough beneath the feet. Sandals for harvest were made with celestic enough to protect against these sharp remnants. The reeds were braided more tightly, leaving less space for straw to catch or pierce. Sometimes, a layer of leather was added, not for warmth, but for toughness, to resist the endless scraping of stubble. Farmers moved slowly through their fields, sandals bearing the marks of the season, the fraying edges of straps, the worn-down soles pressed flat by long hours of work. Yet still, they endured, carrying their wearers through one of the busiest and most demanding times of the year. In the spring, sandals changed once again. The rains filled canals and fields, and the ground, once hard and dry, grew soft. Even to walk across such soil required lightness, for heavy sandals sank and stuck. Spring sandals, therefore, were lighter, their soles braided more loosely, their straps less rigid. They dried quickly, important in a season when dampness touched every part of life. Children waded through puddles in them, their laughter rising above, dripping of eaves. Farmers crossed wet fields, their sandals splashing softly in the mud. Women walked to markets with baskets, their feet light against the moist earth, trusting the flexibility of their spring sandals to carry them without burden. This seasonal cycle was not abrupt, but gradual. Just as the sky did not change overnight, neither did sandals. Families adjusted slowly, altering their designs as the needs of each day shifted. A strap might be replaced with leather as the air grew cooler. A sole might be thickened with one more braid. A stravis drew near. By the time the seasons had turned fully, the sandals reflected the change without anyone needing to announce it. Life moved in rhythm, quiet and steady, guided not by sudden decisions, but by the natural flow of time. The sandals of Mesopotamia, then, were records of the year. To look at them was to see the season in which they were made. A thin, airy pair spoke of summer's heat. A thick, leather-backed pair spoke of winter's chill. A frayed sole spoke of harvest fields. A damp, flexible sandal spoke of spring rains. They were not only objects, but memories, carrying within their fibers the imprint of the earth, the air, and the labor of those who shaped them. There was also beauty in their adaptation. Though sandals remained simple in form, they showed a quiet ingenuity. The makers did not resist the seasons, but worked with them, adjusting materials and methods to meet each new challenge. In this way, sandals became reflections of Mesopotamian rosin. They were humble, yes, but also enduring, shaped not for display but for survival, comfort, and the gentle balance of daily life. In the evenings, families often spoke of the day's weather, of how sandals had fared against the heat, the cold, or the dampness. A father might remark on the sturdiness of his thick-soled pair after hours in the field. A child might show the frayed strap that needed mending. A mother might note the way leather had softened with oil, keeping her feet warm even on the coldest mornings. These conversations, though simple, carried meaning. They were reminders that sandals were not distant objects but intimate companions, touching the body directly, shaping every step, and carrying every person through the shifting seasons of the year. And so, the cycle continued, year after year. Sandals wore out, were repaired, were replaced. New pairs were braided, soles thickened or thinned, straps adjusted, always in harmony with the season at hand. The craft was never grand, never meant for display in temples or palaces. It was ordinary, belonging to courtyards and fields, toll markets and riversides. Yet in its ordinariness lay its beauty, for it revealed the heart of Mesopotamian life, patient, adaptable, attuned to the quiet rhythm of nature. If we close our eyes now, we can walk through the year in Mesopotamia, step by step. We can feel the hot ground of summer beneath our soles, the straps light against our skin. We can sense the coolness of autumn, the thickened leather holding us. Steady, we can walk through harvest stubble, the sturdy braids protecting us from sharp stalks. We can cross the damp fields of spring, sandals light and quick-drying beneath our feet. And with each step, we feel the care of those who made them, their patience of fingers braiding, the wisdom of lives lived in harmony with the seasons. In this way, sandals were never just objects of use. They were companions to the year, partners in the turning of time. To wear them was talk not only across the earth, but through the seasons themselves, each step carrying the memory of sun, rain, wind, and soil. They remind us, even now, that adaptation is its own kind of beauty, and that quiet resilience can be found in the simplest of things. Before the sun rose fully above the horizon, when the sky was only pale with the first suggestion of light, the marketplace of a Mesopotamian town would begin to stir. It was not loud, not hurried, but gentle, like a household waking from sleep. A faint mist clung to the streets, lifting slowly as warm air touched it. Merchants, wrapped in simple cloths, moved quietly toward their stalls, carrying the goods they had prepared in the days. Among the baskets of grain, coils of rope, mats woven from reeds, and jars of oil, there were sandals. They were placed neatly in small piles, their soles stacked together, their straps resting lightly as if waiting for the feet that would soon claim them. The market was not a place of luxury. It was a place of necessity, of exchange, where daily life revealed itself in its simplest forms. Finished sandals, though humble, carried asthmatic weight as jars of barley or bundles of dates. Without them, walking across the hard earth, the hot soil or damp fields was difficult. So, like bread, Sandals were things that households returned to again and again. A family might come to the market not with excitement, but with steady expectation, knowing that here, amid the soft murmur of barter, they would find what they needed to carry them through the weeks ahead. At dawn, the marketplace had its own atmosphere, one that was calmer than the bustle of later hours. Fires smoldered in clay ovens, sending out the scent of fresh bread that drifted through the air. Women brought baskets balanced on their heads, filled with herbs, onions, and greens. Their steps, quiet but purposeful. Men carried bundles of reeds or jars of milk, setting them gently down upon woven mats. In corners, children helped arrange goods, smoothing mozza, brushing dust from sandals before placing them on display. Every sound was softened by the hour. The shuffle of feet, the low calls of merchants, the crackle of firewood. It was a beginning, unhurried and unforced. The Sandals on display varied with the season and the maker. Some were light, thin-soled pears for summer, airy with reed straps. Others were thicker, with leather cut and smoothed, meant for cooler days or for longer journeys. The makers brought them tied in bundles, carried carefully on backs or in baskets. At the stall, they were spread out with care, not in rows of showmanship, but in neat, practical piles. A customer, approaching quietly, would bend to lift a pair, feeling the weight, testing the straps between fingers, pressing the sole to judge its firmness. There was little speech at first, only the thoughtful silence of hands testing craft. When words did come, they were soft and measured. Bargaining was not a contest, but a conversation, an exchange of need and value. A man might offer a measure of barley for a pair of sandals, explaining that his old ones had frayed at the heel. A woman might trade a jar of sesame oil for 2 pairs, one for herself and one for her child, pointing gently to the boy at her side. The sandal maker would nod, adjust the terms, and hand over the pairs without ceremony. There were no shouts, no gestures of excess. The market, even in its commerce, was calm, rooted in the quiet recognition that everyone here depended on one another for survival. Sandals were never seen as luxuries. They did not glitter like ornaments or perfumes brought from afar. They did not carry the prestige of copper tools or carved figurines. But their very ordinariness was their strength. They were woven from the same reeds that built mats and baskets, from the same fibers that lined roofs and sheltered homes. To sell sandals was to be part of a larger circle of labor, one that tied together farmers, weavers, bakers, and traders. In the marketplace, this connection became visible. A basket maker might sit beside a sandal maker, both displaying work born from the materials, shaped by the same patient hands. The atmosphere of dawn gave the sandals another layer of meaning. In the soft light, their forms looked modest, but enduring. The reeds, still faintly fragrant from the river, gave off a fresh scent when handled. The leather, darkened with oil, shone gently as the sun climbed higher. They seemed to rest there not as lifeless objects, but as quiet companions, waiting for new journeys. Each sandal had been shaped in a courtyard, tied with patience, smoothed by hand. To see them in the market was to see the continuation of that labor, the passage of care from maker to wearer, from household to household. As Thimarin wore on, the market grew livelier, but in these early hours, sandals found their place in peace. Children's simits tried them on, slipping feet into pairs too large, laughing softly as they walked unsteadily across Thetis. Merchants watched with indulgence, adjusting straps, showing how knots might be tied more securely. These small lessons, given in passing, carried forward traditions, teaching the young how to handle and care for the simplest of tools. In this way, even the act of trying on sandals was part of a larger rhythm of learning, off growing into the tasks of daily life. The presence of sandals in markets also reminded people of time itself. To purchase a new pair was to acknowledge that seasons had passed, that old soles had worn thin, that journeys had left their mark. A frayed strap, a flattened braid, a cracked solo were quiet signs of use, reminders that life moved steadily forward. The new sandals, sturdy and fresh, carried the promise of days ahead, of work in the fields, of walks to rivers, of visits to neighbors. In their simplicity, they became markers of continuity, steps linking past to future without fanfare. Not every family bought sandals at markets. Many made their own, in courtyards and at riverbanks. Yet even they came to the market to see what others had made, to compare methods, to trade ideas along with goods. The The marketplace was not only a place of exchange, but also of quiet learning. A woman might notice the way another maker twisted straps more tightly. A man might observe how households had been layered differently for strength. These observations, absorbed without rivalry, became part of Theslo's evolution of craft, passed from stall to stall, generation to generation. When the sun rose high and the marketplace grew crowded, the sandals often had already found their new owners. Empty space remained where neat piles had once been, leaving only dust and footprints as reminders. The merchants, their baskets lighter, leaned back in the shade, watching as the crowd thickened with noise and heat. But the calm often lingered. In memory, the image of sandals waiting in the quiet, the smell of bread and reeds mingling, the soft murmur of barter drifting like a song. The story of sandals in the market is, at its heart, the story of life in Mesopotamia itself. It was never dramatic, never gilded with excess. It was steady, ordinary, woven into the rhythm of survival and care. To walk through the market at dawn was to see that rhythm made visible. Sandals stacked beside mats, bread beside jars, families moving with purpose but without haste. It was a scene that repeated day after day, season after season, as reliable as the rivers that nourished the land. If we imagine ourselves there now, standing in the soft light of dawn, we can feel the calm of the marketplace settling over us. We can smell the smoke of ovens, the sweetness of roasted grain, the freshness of reeds still damp from the river. We can hear the low voices of barter, the gentle laughter of children, the quiet creak of leather being tested by hand, and in front of us, we see the sandals, simple, sturdy, waiting, part of the greater circle of life that has carried humanity through countless mornings. Every sandal left a mark, though few lasted for long. On the dry paths that stretched across Mesopotamia's wide plains, the impressions were light, a faint outline pressed into dust, the shape of the sole, the crossing lines of braids, the small circles where straps had rubbed into the surface all appeared for a moment, then began to fade. A passing breeze carried grains of sand over them, softening their edges until they vanished. Yet, while they lasted, these footprints spoke quietly, of movement, of life unfolding step by step. The dust itself was part of the rhythm of the land. It clung to walls, settled on reeds, and coated the surface of the sandals themselves. Every walk stirred it, every movement lifted it into the air. In the morning, when the sun first touched the ground, the footprints seemed sharp and fresh, the lines of braided soles clear against the pale earth. By evening, most had been erased, leaving only the sense that many had walked there before. This cycle of appearing and vanishing was part of daily life, as familiar as the rising of the rivers or the turning of the seasons. After rain, the story or footprints changed. The clay streets, damp and soft, remembered every step for longer. When sandals pressed into them, they left deeper marks, ridges of braided reeds, sharp lines where leather straps cut into the surface. In some places, the impressions dried in the sun, hardening until the next shower washed them away. In others, they filled with water, turning footprints into small pools that mirrored the sky. Children, walking through them, laughed as they left new tracks, their smaller soles overlapping those of adults. These clay paths were like quiet records, showing not only that people had passed, but how many, in what direction, and at what pace. From these footprints, much could be learned. The deep impressions of thick-soled sandals told of heavy loads carried across fields. The light narrow steps spoke of children running or women walking quickly to markets. Clusters of prints near canals showed where water had been drawn, where neighbors gathered to fill jars or wash reeds. The patterns were simple, yet together they formed a map of life, traced not on parchment but on the very earth itself. To walk those streets was to read the stories written in dust and clay. The sandals bore the weight of work, and the ground recorded it faithfully. Farmers left long lines of footprints stretching from homes to fields, paths repeated so often that even when the dust blew over, the way was clear. Merchants left scattered tracks around markets, their sandals pressing deeper as baskets pulled at their shoulders. Children's prints clustered around courtyards, their zigzagging patterns telling of play. Even priests and temple attendants left their marks, solemn and measured, leading toward steps of baked brick where sandals were often removed before entering sacred spaces. All of this was written across the ground, a script of movement too ordinary to preserve, yet to Constanto ignore. In the courtyards, footprints carried a different tone. Here, the ground was swept daily, yet the traces of sandals returned again and again. The soles pressed gently into clay floors, their marks faint but numerous. They showed where families gathered, where weaving was done, where meals were shared. The constant repetition smoothed the earth, polishing it with use, even without lasting impressions. The very surface of the courtyard became a memory of steps, worn soft by generations who had walked the same small space. The beauty of these footprints lay in their impermanence. They were never meant to last forever, yet for as long as they remained, they told stories. A cluster of overlapping prints spoke of a gathering, neighbors pausing to talk, children circling in play. A lone set of tracks leading away from a home spoke of someone leaving early, perhaps to fields before dawn. Wide, trampled areas showed the passage of markets or festivals. Narrow, worn paths through fields showed where sandals had followed rows of grains season after season. Each print was fragile, but together they formed the memory of life itself, carried quietly in dust and clay. Sometimes, footprints revealed more than presence. They showed condition. A broken sandal left uneven marks, the pattern of the sole interrupted by gaps. A strap to loose left, shifting outlines, the foot sliding within its frame. Heavier steps sank deeper. Lighter ones barely brushed the surface. To an attentive eye, the footprints told not only who had passed it but how they moved, whether burdened, hurried, or at ease. In this way, the ground became a silent witness, recording the physical state of those who walked across it. In fields, the footprints mingled with those of animals. Hooves of cattle and donkeys overlapped with human sandals, blending into a shared texture. The deep cuts of plow blades added their own lines, making the soil a layered canvas of labor. During planting, the prints were spread evenly across furrows, showing the careful rhythm of sowing. During harvest, they gathered more densely, circling where sheaves had been bound and lifted. In both cases, the sandals bore the burden of thessazin, pressing their patterns into earth that would soon be turned again, renewed for the next cycle of growth. By canals, footprints told stories of water. Bare feet often appeared beside sandal prints where people removed their footwear to step directly into the shallows. Children left small tracks leading into mud, their toes splayed wide, their sandals abandoned nearby. Adults left careful prints along the edges, balanced between firm ground and slippery clay. These places were busy, yet not chaotic. They held the steady rhythm of life's necessity, each footprint a reminder of water's central place in survival. At temple steps, footprints carried quiet reverence. Sandals, often removed before entry, left clusters of marks at the base, overlapping in countless layers. The ground here was worn smooth, pressed by generations of worshippers who had approached. In humility, inside, the cool floors carried no footprints, but the memory of them lingered outside, in the dust and clay where sandals waited. These sacred spaces showed the blend of ordinary craft and spiritual life. The same sandals that and markets also carried their wearers to the gods, leaving their imprints at thresholds where earth and heaven touched. The fleeting nature of footprints did not lessen their meaning. If anything, it deepened it. They reminded people that life was always in motion, that steps were taken and then erased, that the earth remembered only for a while. This mirrored human existence itself, brief, ordinary, but filled with meaning while it lasted. To walk in sandals was to leave a mark, however small, and to accept that the wind and rain would soon take it away. Yet for the time it remained, the footprint was a testament to presence, to the quiet resilience of daily life. Even now, archaeologists uncover ancient footprints preserved in hardened clay moments, when chance allowed what was fleeting to endure. These impressions, sometimes thousands of years old, show the same braided patterns of soles, the same shapes of human feet. To see them is to feel time collapse, to know that the steps of ancient Mesopotamians still lie beneath our gaze. They are rare, but they confirm what dust and memory have long told us, that sandals carried people everywhere, and that everywhere they went, they left traces behind. If we pause to imagine ourselves there, standing on a Mesopotamian path, we can look down and see the prints before us. Some are sharp and fresh, others already blurring. They lead in many directions: Toth River, to the fields, to the marketplace, to the temple. The air is still, carrying the faint scent of damp clay. A breeze stirs, lifting a little dust, softening the edges of the marks. Soon, they will be gone, but for now, they are red glare, and in them, we see not only the steps of strangers, long vanished, but reflections of ourselves, our own movement, our own impermanence, our own quiet journey across earth that never stops remembering, even as it. In the world of ancient Mesopotamia, life was not divided into the sacred and the ordinary, as we might imagine it today. The two were woven together, step by step, much like the sandals that carried people through their days. Even in temples, those most solemn places of prayer and ritual, sandals appeared not as ornaments of grandeur, but as quiet companions, humbly present at thresholds, courtyards, and stairways. They served the body, but in doing so, they also touched the spirit. Each worn pair carried both earth and devotion, bridging the path between daily labor and sacred offering. Temples rose like mountains of baked brick above the flat land, their steps drawing eyes upward toward the heavens. Approaching them, a worshipper, sandals pressed softly into the dust, leaving marks that gathered with thousands of others. Yet before entering, these sandals were often removed, set aside at the threshold. This act was not hurried, but careful, almost tender, for it carried meaning. To step into sacred ground was to meet the divine with bare feet, unshielded, connected directly to the earth. The sandals, humble though they were, marked the boundary between the everyday and the eternal. At temple entrances, this sight was familiar. Rows of woven sandals neatly placed in piles or scattered in small clusters. Their reeds, the fragrance of the fields, some bore the imprints of heavy use, frayed at the edges, straps softened by oil and sweat. Others looked newer, freshly woven, perhaps gifts from a family member or traded at a resale. Together they formed a quiet collection, a testimony that the divine was approached not by kings alone, but by ordinary villagers, farmers, weavers, and children. Their sandals told stories without words, stories left behind while prayers rose within. Priests and temple attendants often wore sandals too, though their summertime leather, stitched with greater care, made soles that endured long hours of standing during rituals. Their straps were stronger, smoothed with oil, made to last through seasons of service. Yet these sandals were not for display. They carried no jewels, no decorations. They were functional, steady, and unassuming companions to sacred duty. To see them was to understand that even those closest to the gods walked on earth as all others did, supported by the same humble craft of woven reeds and simple leather. Inside temple courtyards, the absence of sandals was just as meaningful as their presence outside. Worshippers walked barefoot across clay floors, their steps light against cool surfaces that had been swept smooth by countless hands. Each bare footprint pressed into dust carried echoes of the sandals left behind, reminding all who entered that they had come from work, from fields and rivers. The act of removing sandals did not erase their presence. Instead, it deepened it, giving weight to the transition from the ordinary world to the sacred one. There was a rhythm to this gesture. People bent low, unfastened straps, set sandals gently aside. Parents helped children slip theirs off, placing the small pairs next to larger ones. Travelers, dusty from long walks, laid their sandals down with a sigh of relief, grateful for the cool stone beneath their feet. Each removal was a pause, a moment of stillness before stepping forward into prayer. The sandals remained at the boundary, silent witnesses to the hopes and petitions carried within. This ritual of leaving sandals behind held deep symbolism. Sandals bore the dust of roads, the mud of fields, the marks of labor. To carry them into a temple would mean carrying the weight of toil and distraction in tow, a space of devotion. By removing them, worshippers symbolically set aside their burdens, presenting thanksgiving to the gods with simplicity and openness. The sandals, resting quietly at thresholds, became vessels holding all that was left outside: fatigue, sweat, and the unending tasks of survival. In some temples, sandals were arranged with order, lined carefully against walls. In others, they lay in loose clusters, mingled together without distinction of owner, rich or poor, young or old. All sandals shared the same ground, equal in their humble waiting. This sight carried its own message. Before the gods, human footsteps were the same. Their sandals did not boast of status or wealth. They spoke only of presence, of the simple truth that someone had walked here with intention. Someone had come to seek the divine. The materials themselves carried antiquity: reeds, drawn from rivers, reminded worshippers of life's flow and the gifts of water. Leather, shaped from animal hides, echoed the sacrifices and provisions that sustained families. Palm fibers, strong and flexible, evoked resilience and endurance. Each pair of sandals carried the story of the natural world into sacred spaces, showing how earth and spirit could not be separated. To remove sandals was not to discard these stories but to honor them, leaving them at the temple's edge where they joined with countless others. Even priests, though set apart for ritual, did not escape this connection. Their sandals, though sturdier, bore the same dust as all others. When they removed them at thresholds, they too acknowledged their humanity, their grounding in the same soil as the people they served. In that act, sandals became quiet reminders of a quality that before gods, all were barefoot, all were earthbound, all sought mercy in the same way. At times of festival, when temples were busiest, the sight of sandals multiplied. Courtyards overflowed with pairs, layered upon each other, straps tangled together in heaps that told of great gatherings. Children searched for theirs after ceremonies, sometimes slipping feet into the wrong pair before laughing and correcting the mistake. The sheer number of sandals showed the strength of community devotion, each pair a voice in the collective chorus of prayer. From a distance they appeared like woven fields laid at the temple's feet, offerings of labor and life woven into humble form. Some sandals, too worn to be used again, were left behind intentionally, abandoned at sacred thresholds as acts of offering. These were not grand sacrifices, but small, personal gestures. A villager might leave his frayed sandals after a season of harvest, thanking the gods for safe passage through long days in the fields. A mother might set down a child's outgrown pair, praying for health and growth in the years ahead. In this way, sandals became more than footwear. They became symbols of gratitude, tokens left where earth touched heaven. Archaeologists, in rare moments, have uncovered remnants of sandals near ancient temples, hardened impressions in clay or fragments preserved by accident. To hold these pieces today is to glimpse the quiet acts of devotion woven into daily life. They remind us that the sacred was never distant, never reserved for the mighty alone. It was approached step by step, in sandals shaped by ordinary hands, carried by ordinary feet, and set aside in reverence. The presence of sandals in sacred spaces revealed something profound, that spirituality was not divorced from daily life. The same sandals that trudged through fields, fetched water from canals, and pressed market dust also carried their wearers to the gods. Their marks on thresholds, their absence in inner chambers, their presence in quiet piles all showed the continuity between survival and worship. Sandals were not ornaments of ritual, but companions of it, humble threads binding the ordinary to the divine. When we imagine those temple steps today, we can almost see them, rows of sandals lying in the soft light of dawn, shadows stretching long across brick walls. We can hear the quiet shuffle of feet, the low murmur of prayer, the sigh of wind over the city. The sandals rest silently, holding the dust of countless roads, waiting for their owner's to return. They are still, yet they speak of movement. They are ordinary, yet they carry meaning. They are absent from the sacred space within, yet their very absence tells us how deeply they belonged to the rhythm of worship. In the end, sandals in sacred spaces remind us that holiness was not found in separation from daily life, but in carrying it forward with humility. To remove sandals was to step into prayer, yet to put them on again was to return to work, to fields and rivers, to families and neighbors. The act of slipping feet back into woven soles after leaving a temple carried its own quiet beauty. It was the moment when the divine and the ordinary touched, when worship folded back into life, step by patient step. In the shaded courtyards of Mesopotamian homes, where the air was cooler and the hum of daily work slowed, children often sat near their parents and grandparents, watching with wide eyes as reeds and palm fibers were transformed into useful things. The weaving of sandals, like so many other tasks, was not something taught in loud lessons or strict commands. Instead, it unfolded gently, almost invisibly, through observation, repetition, and time. Children absorbed the knowledge as naturally as they learned to walk or to speak. In these quiet spaces, surrounded by the steady rhythm of everyday life, the first sparks of skill began to take shape. The process began with watching. A child, perhaps no older than 5 or 6, would sit cross-legged at the edge of the courtyard, leaning against the sun-warmed wall of mud brick. In front of them, an elder's hands moved with slow confidence, splitting reeds, softening fibers, knotting cords, and pressing soles into flat spirals. To the child, it might have looked like magic, the way a bundle of rough stalks could, little by little, become something that carried a family member across the fields or through the market. The child's small fingers itched to try, to mimic, to test what seemed at once ordinary and mysterious. The first attempts were always uneven. A reed would bend you sharply, snapping instead of folding. Knots slipped loose, tangles formed quickly, and braids looked more like nests than strands. Yet none of this was a failure. Parents and elders did not scold but smiled softly, encouraging the child to try again. Every uneven braid was cherished, kept for a while, sometimes even tied into a corner of a mat or hung on a wall. These small pieces were less about usefulness than about a child's first step into the craft. Learning in this way was never hurried. The rhythm of teaching matched the rhythm of life itself, paced by seasons, by harvests, by festivals. A child might spend weeks practicing simplechnots before moving on to braiding. They might spend a whole summer experimenting with how tightly to twist palm fibers without breaking them. There was no set timeline, no expectation that skill would come quickly. Instead, there was patience, born of the understanding that mastery was not a single achievement, but a gradual folding across years. Often, children practiced in groups. Cousins, siblings, and neighbors gathered in courtyards, shaded by palm branches or overhanging cloth, their laughter mingling with the soft sound of reeds being split. They challenged one another in playful ways. Who could braid the longest cord? Who could tie the neatest knot? Who could weave a tiny soul without it falling apart? Their work was often scattered with mistakes, but mistakes were part of the music. In these moments, craft was less about the object produced and more about bonds woven between the young. Elders guided with gestures more than words. A grandmother might press her hand over a child's, steadying their movement as they drew a reed through a braid. A father might demonstrate how to press a sole flat with the palm, then quietly hand the task over. A mother might soak reeds in a basin, inviting her child to feel the difference between stiff, dry stalks and those made supple by water. Knowledge passed from skin to skin, from hand to hand, in a way that was intimate and lasting. Children's first sandals were rarely worn. They were often too loose, too uneven, the straps set at awkward angles. Still, they were celebrated. A small pair might be set aside as a keepsake, reminding the family of a season when the child took their first steps, not just in walking, but in creating. Sometimes these little sandals were offered at temples, placed beside candles or clay figurines as tokens of devotion. In that gesture, the learning of a child became part of the spiritual life of the community, woven into the greater rhythm of offering and gratitude. Learning the craft also connected children to the natural world. They learned not only how to weave reeds, but how to gather them, how to recognize which stalks were ready, which fibers were too brittle, and how to soak palm fronds to release their strength. Through the craft, they gained an intimate knowledge of rivers, marshes, and groves. The act of weaving sandals became a lesson in ecology, teaching children that human survival was bound to the gifts of land and water. To learn the craft was to learn respect for plants, for soil, for the cycle of growth and renewal. There was also a rhythm of storytelling that accompanied these lessons. As elders worked, they often spoke softly, sharing tales of ancestors who walked long journeys in woven sandals, or of gods who blessed the fields where reeds grew thickest. For the children, the stories stitched the craft into something larger than utility. Weaving was not just about footwear, it was about belonging, about carrying forward traditions that stretched back through generations. Each knot tied was a thread in the fabric of history. Children often remembered their first successful braid with clarity, the moment when their fingers moved with both intention and ease. It might have been a small cord, nothing more than a short length of twisted fiber, but it represented confidence, the realization that hands could create as well as hold. These small victories built slowly, adding up over time until child could produce soles strong enough to walk upon, straps neat enough to hold, and pairs of sandals that looked like those of their parents. In families where weaving was central to survival, the learning carried a sense of quiet responsibility. A child's growing skill meant one more pair of hands contributing to the household. one more person able to provide, yet the responsibility was never forced. The learning came with encouragement, laughter, and shared moments. In this way, the burden of necessity was softened, transformed into a practice of care. Evenings were often the most peaceful times of teaching. As the sun set and the air cooled, familiars scared in courtyards lit by oil lamps, shadows flickered on walls while the day's work slowed. Children sat close to their parents, reeds spread across mats, and hands moved in rhythm. Outside, the murmur of the river might be heard, steady and calm. Inside, the murmurs of instruction blended with the creak of fibers. These wereth hours when bonds deepened, when knowledge passed most naturally, when the act of weaving sandals became inseparable from the act of weaving family. As years passed, children became more skilled, their braids tighter, their soles flatter, their straps more secure. They began to teach younger siblings, repeating the same gentle guidance once given to them. In this way, the craft never belonged to one generation alone. It flowed like oth rivers, carrying knowledge steadily forward. The sandals themselves wore out in time, but the skill that created them endured, preserved in the hands of the young. The beauty of this process lay not in perfection but in continuity. The first crooked braids of a child, though rough, contained within them the seeds of mastery. Each era was part of the learning, each repetition a step closer to skill. In the end, the true lesson was not simply how to make sandals, but how to live with patience, care, and humility, values as enduring as the craft itself. When we imagine these scenes now, we see more than children with reeds and fibers. We see the flow of tradition across centuries, the quiet resilience of families who understood that survival depended not only on tools but on teaching. In the shaded courtyards of Mesopotamia, under the soft light of oil lamps, generations learned to weave sandals. In their laughter and their concentration, in their mistakes and their triumphs, they carried forward a heritage as humble as it was essential. The sandals, simple as they were, became more than footwear. They became symbols of continuity, of connection between young and old, of the endless cycle of learning and sharing. Through them, children learned not only how to walk, but how to create, not only how to survive, but to belong. In the steady rhythm of Mesopotamian life, sandals walked countless paths. They pressed into riverbanks as people gathered reeds at dawn. They carried men and women through dusty fields where barley and wheat swayed in the breeze. They left marks in the clay streets of small towns, softened by rain, and crossed stone courtyards on the way to markets or temples. With each step, the woven soles grew thinner, the straps stretched, the edges frayed. Nothing lasted forever. Yet in this impermanence lay its own quiet beauty. Sandals were not cast aside at the first sign of wear. They were mended, cared for, given new life. In this way, the craft of weaving extended beyond creation. Repair was just as vital as making, a continuation of the bond between people and turtles that served them. When a sandal began to show signs of wear, it rarely came as a surprise. The fibers didn't break suddenly, but softened slowly over weeks of use. A strap that once sat snug across the foot began to loosen. The edge of a sole that once lay flat started to curl. These changes were felt before they were seen. Small shifts beneath the skin, reminders that the sandal, like its wearer, was shaped by the passage of time. Such reminders carried no sense of frustration. They were simply part of life. The repair of sandals was most often done at home. In shaded courtyards, the same places where weaving began, families gathered to mend what had been worn. A mother might sit with a sandal in her lap, her fingers pressing gently against its frayed edge, assessing what needed to be replaced. A father might heat a small oil in the embers of the hearth, preparing tapias, a new hole for a strap. Children, eager to help, might fetch reeds from a bundle or soak them in a basin of water until they were soft enough to use. Repair was not rushed, nor was it seen as separate from daily life. It was woven into the rhythm of evenings, into conversations, into the hum of shared labor. The act of repair began with careful observation. The weaver looked closely at the sandal, turning it over in the light, studying each weak point. Was it the sole that had worn thin, needing new layers braided in? Or was it the strap that had snapped, requiring replacement or reinforcement? Each sandal carried its own history of wear, its own story of where it had traveled and how it had endured. The repairer's task was not to erase this history, but to extend it. towed new chapters to the tale already written in reeds and fibers. Sometimes repair meant unweaving. A section off sole, too frayed to hold, might be gently unwound. The strands separated until only the strong parts remained. New reeds were then added, woven into the old, their colors brighter against the faded fibers, like fresh growth sprouting from ancient roots. The contrast was never hidden. It was accepted as part of the object's life. A sandal with patches and rewoven sections was not seen as lesser, but as seasoned, bearing the marks of care and continuity. Leather sandals, too, required mending. Straps that cracked under the heat of the sun could be softened again with oil, rubbed patiently until the fibers relaxed. Tiers were stitched with careful, even threads. The needle guided through holes pierced with a simple awl. Patches of hide were sewn onto soles where stone shad worn them thin, creating a mosaic of repairs that told of long journeys walked. In some cases, sandals were enforced with small knots of reed tied tightly around weak points, blending materials in ways that were practical and enduring. The tools used for repair were as humble as those for weaving. A sharp flint blade cut away damaged fibers. Smooth pebbles pressed new reeds flat into their places. An all-weather of bone or copper created holes for stitching. These tools carried their own histories of use, edges dulled from repeated work, handles polished by the touch of many hands. They were not precious in themselves, yet they were essential companions, ready to serve again and again. Repair was also an act of memory. Each mend called attention to the journeys that had worn the sandal thin. A frayed strap might recall long walks to distant markets. A patched sole might remind its wearer of days spent in the fields, treading over sharp stubble after harvest. To mend was to remember, to hold in one's hands not only the object, but the life it had carried. Sandals bore witness to their owner's steps, and repairing them was a way of honoring that witness, ensuring it could continue a little. There was no shame in wearing repaired sandals. On the contrary, they were valued. A sandal with visible mends showed resilience, thrift, and care. It demonstrated that nothing was wasted, that life was lived with resourcefulness and respect for the gifts of the earth. In markets, one could see sandals with patches, straps of different shades, soles with both old and new reeds intertwined. They walked the same paths as fresh pairs, carrying their owners with equal steadiness. Children often learned repair before they mastered weaving. Their smaller tasks, tightening a loose strap, trimming frayed fibers, rubbing oil into entrusted toying hands. These acts were less demanding than creating a sandal from the beginning, yet they carried equal. Through repair, children gained confidence in their ability to care for the objects around them. They learned patience, dexterity, and the value of extending life, rather than replacing it. Their laughter often mixed with the quiet concentration of elders as they sat together, weaving old with new. The cycle of wearing and repairing reflected a broader truth about Mesopotamian life. Nothing was permanent, and nothing was discarded without thought. Just as fields were renewed each season, sandals were renewed with every mend. The rivers that fed the reeds also wore away their banks. Yet people shaped the water into canals, guiding it again and again. Life was sustained not by permanence, but by renewal, by the willingness to adapt, to mend, to carry forward. Even sandals that were beyond repair still held value. The reeds could be stripped and reused in other style crafts. Leather could be cut into straps for tying bundles or stitched into protective coverings. Fragments that could not be used again were sometimes burned, their smoke carrying a faint fragrance of earth and oil, a reminder that nothing truly vanished but transformed. In this way, sandals lived many lives, continuing to serve long after their first shape had worn away. The sight of a repaired sandal carried its own quiet poetry. Straps of different thicknesses tied together, soles patched with overlapping reeds, stitches crossing old cracks like lines of age on a face. Each imperfection was a mark of survival, a record of endurance. To walk in such sandals was to carry both the past and the present beneath one's feet, to step forward supported by the care that had been given in earlier moments. Repair also carried a spiritual dimension. In temples, where sandals were often left at thresholds, some pairs bore the marks of many mends. Worshippers carried their repaired sandals to sacred spaces, their patches as much offerings as the sandals themselves. To stand barefoot in prayer after removing sandals was to acknowledge not only the gods but the long path walked to reach their presence. In this way, repair became part of devotion, a symbol of persistence and gratitude. The patience required for repair mirrored the patience required for life. Just as sandals could not be mended in haste, lives could not be lived with. Families knew that difficulties would come: floods, droughts, illness, loss. Yet they also knew that, like sandals, life could be patched, strengthened, carried forward. Repair was not only a craft but a philosophy, teaching resilience in the face of wear. Evenings often ended with the soft sound of repair. Families gathered, meals, oil lamps casting warm light on courtyards. The air carried the scent of reeds drying, of leather warmed by touch. Elders worked steadily, their hands guiding fibers, while younger ones watched and imitated. Outside, the night deepened, stars mirrored in the slow currents of the river. Inside, sandals found new life, prepared to walk again when the sun rose. The continuity of this practice meant that sandals became more than objects of use. They became companions. A sandal repaired many times carried with it a bond of familiarity, like a trusted friend. It fit the foot more comfortably with each wear, softened in the places where skin pressed it hardest, shaped by the unique journey of its owner. To repair such a sandal was to preserve not just material relationship, ensuring the companionship could continue. When we think of Mesopotamian sandals today, we might imagine them only as artifacts, displayed in museums or reconstructed from fragments. Yet to the people who wore them, they were living objects, carrying daily steps, receiving daily care. Their repairs told stories that artifacts alone cannot fully capture: the patience of families, the resilience of communities, the deep respect for what the earth provided. In the end, worn sandals and their repairs remind us of a simple truth, that life is not about perfection or permanence, but about endurance, renewal, and care. Every mend was a gesture of hope, a belief that what had served once could serve again. In each patch, each stitch, each tightened knot, the people of Mesopotamia wove their philosophy into the soles beneath their feet. And so the sandals walked, unpatched, frayed, rewoven, yet still carrying their owners across dust and clay, through fields and courtyards, into markets and temples. Step by step, mend by mend, they continued their quiet service, bearing witness to lives lived with humility and devotion. Not all sandals were alike, and in their small variations we glimpse the patterns of Mesopotamian society. Farmers, rising before dawn to walk the fields, usually wore the simplest reed soles. These were fashioned quickly, sturdy enough to endure the heat of packed earth and the dampness of irrigation channels, yet humble, made from materials close at hand. The sandals of farmers bore the marks of labor-frayed edges from contact with straw, water stains from muddy canals, a loosened strap where the foot pressed hardest with each step into furrowed ground. Such sandals carried not only the farmer, but also the story of toil, of sowing seed and harvesting grain, of bending beneath the sun in the endless cycle of seasons. In contrast, the sandals of officials and merchants showed a touch more refinement. They might still be woven from reeds or crafted from leather, but care was taken in the details. A smoother finish, a strap carefully cut, or a line of stitching that followed the curve of the sole gave them distinction. They were not ostentatious, for Mesopotamian society valued practicality over display in matters of everyday attire. But they reflected roles where presence mattered as much as function. A merchant arriving in the market, his sandals neatly tied and oiled to resist wear, conveyed both readiness for trade and a sense of reliability. An official, stepping into a temple courtyard, might wear leather sandals whose soles were stitched twice for strength, projecting steadiness and authority. These subtleties remind us that objects as ordinary as sandals carried with them quiet markers of status. Yet unlike jewelry or elaborate garments reserved for ceremonies, sandals were always tempered by necessity. The materials chosen of social standing, though gently, never with the sharp distinctions seen in later cultures. Reeds were the most common, available to anyone living near the rivers. Leather, however, required resources: livestock to provide hides, tools to cut and soften them, oils to keep them supple. A family of modest means might own a single pair of leather sandals, reserved for festivals or important visits, while relying on reed sandals for daily. Wealthier households could afford more durable pairs, sometimes crafted with layered soles that lasted longer on journeys. Yet even among the well-to-do, extravagance was rare. A sandal was meant to carry one across dust and clay, not to proclaim superiority. In this way, necessity softened the boundaries between classes. The king himself might ride in a chariot, but when his feet touched the earth, they too were covered by sandals that shared their form with those of his subjects. The differences between sandals also echoed the rhythms of work. Soldiers required sturdier pairs than farmers or scribes. A soldier's sandals might be reinforced with thicker leather soles, bound tightly with straps around the ankles to keep them secure during marches. Their design reflected endurance, built to carry a man across rocky ground or through shifting sands. Priests, by contrast, often wore sandals with finer workmanship. Their pairs were not luxurious but carefully maintained, polished with oil and stitched evenly, for they were worn in sacred spaces where order and dignity mattered. The sandals of scribes, who sat for long hours in the shade of temple walls, were modest but well kept, reflecting a life of stillness rather than movement. In this way, sandals became quiet symbols of occupation, each pair molded not only to the foot but also to the role of the wearer. In families, sandals also reflected responsibility and age. A child's sandals, often the smallest reed soles, carried the playful wear of running across courtyard sand, splashing in irrigation canals. Their straps frayed more quickly, loosened by restless feet. Adolescents might be given sturdier pairs as they began to help in the fields or markets, their sandals becoming signs of growing labor and duty. Elders often wore softened, well-mended sandals, their soles thin but comfortable, shaped by years of walking. To see the sandals lined together at a household's threshold was to see a picture of the family itself. Small pairs with uneven braids, larger pairs patched and sturdy, each one an imprint of the life it carried. Markets revealed these distinctions most clearly. In the morning bustle, one could see farmers arriving in sandals shastily tied, reeds still damp from being soaked the night before. Merchants, preparing to sit behind stalls of grain, fish, or cloth, adjusted leather straps that had been rubbed with oil to resist dust. Officials arriving with scribes to oversee transactions walked with sandals more carefully made, their soles flattened by the work of skilled hands. And yet, as the market filled with the scent of bread and the murmur of barter, these distinctions blurred. A farmer might sell enough grain to buy a new pair of leather sandals. A merchant, after a long day, might return home with his soles frayed from the same dust that clung to a laborer's feet. The market was a place of meeting, where sandals of every kind pressed the same ground, equalized by the rhythm of shared survival. Sandals also reflected gendered roles, though again in subtle ways. Women who worked within households often wore lighter sandals, easier to slip on and off while moving between courtyard, storerooms, and hearth. Women who labored in fields, however, needed sturdier pairs, woven tightly to endure uneven ground. Decorativities were rare, but sometimes a strap was braided more finely, or leather cut with smoother edges, not for show but as an expression of quiet care in the making. Men's sandals tended to be larger, reinforced for heavier tasks, yet the basic form remained the same. In this, sandals reflected a truth of Mesopotamian society. Fatha tasks were divided, the tools of life were shared. Ceremonial occasions offered perhaps the clearest glimpse of how sandals could signify role and standing. At festivals, when processions moved through temple courtyards, some officials wore sandals with carefully matched straps, their symmetry a sign of order. Musician sand dancers often performed barefoot, their sandals laid aside, reminding all that ritual sometimes called for direct contact with the earth. Priests might carry their sandals with care, removing them before entering sacred thresholds, the act itself a gesture of humility. Even here, however, the sandals were not elaborate ornaments, but practical objects treated with reverence. Their role was not to dazzle but to serve as silent companions in the transition between the ordinary and the sacred. We can also see in sandals the delicate balance between individuality and community. While each pair was shaped to the foot of its wearer, molded over time by unique patterns of movement, the basic form was shared by all. A sandal was deeply personal, yet also communal. Tito traditions of weaving, repair, and exchange. This duality reflected social roles themselves, each person distinct in task and standing, yet all bound within the broader fabric of community. Just as reeds were braided together to form souls, lives were braided together to sustain society. The humble variations in sandals remind us that in Mesopotamia, identity was expressed less through outward display than through participation in shared rhythmas worship, and survival. A farmer's red soles, worn thin by furrows, a merchant's polished leather straps, a priest's carefully kept pair set aside before sacred rituals, told a story not of vanity but of role. Sandals were practical, yes, but in their quiet differences they traced the outlines of society itself. And yet, when all walked across the same ground, those outlines softened. Dust clung to every sole, reeds frayed in every household, leather cracked beneath the same sun. The divisions between roles were visible, but the necessities of life wove them back together. In this way, sandals became a reminder of balance between status and humility, individuality and community, labor and dignity. Through them we glimpse a society where even the simplest objects held meaning, where the soles beneath one's feet carried not only the body but also the imprint of social life. To study Mesopotamian sandals is to walk quietly through the layers of its society, step by step, finding in each pair a reflection of role, necessity, and the enduring human search for steadiness on the paths of life. When archaeologists bend low over the earth of Mesopotamia, brushing away soil that has lain undisturbed for thousands of years, they sometimes uncover fragments that are so small, so quiet, that they could almost be overlooked. Not the grand stones of ziggurats, nor the carefully pressed tablets of kings, but softened pieces, half-reed hardened by time, faint imprints pressed long ago into drying clay, or a strip of leather curled upon itself in dust. These fragments are what remain of sandals, once humble companions to daily life, now reduced to delicate traces that whisper of the people who wore them. They are fragile, often brittle to the touch, yet in their silence they carry an entire world. A sandal strap, frayed and darkened by centuries, tells us of the hands that braided it, the courtyard where it dried, the feet it once encircled as a child ran across stone floors or an elder walked carefully to the temple, an imprint pressed into clay, left behind when someone stepped onto a still soft surface, captures in its shallow curve a single step, a single moment of movement, frozen by chance yet preserved for millennia. These traces remind us that history is not always told through grand monuments or royal decrees, but through the smallest of survivals, the ordinary things that endure against time in unexpected ways. Archaeologists work with patient tools, brushes, soft as feathers, picks gentle enough to tease apart layers of compacted soil, and screens that sift dust in search of what is hidden within. As they work, they encounter sandals in fragments more often than in whole. A twisted braid of reed here, a hardened sole there, a pattern of stitching imprinted in earth. Each fragment must be studied carefully, compared to other finds, pieced together like parts of a forgotten puzzle. Through such fragments, they reconstruct the shape of Mesopotamian life. In museum cases today, one may see sandals preserved by accident of circumstance, a pair left in a sealed jar, untouched by moisture, or scraps found in a layer of ash that hardened around them. They look simple, even crude, yet they hold immeasurable value because they connect us to footsteps once taken. To gaze upon them imagine the rhythm of ancient streets, merchants arriving at market, farmers crossing fields, priests removing sandals at temple thresholds, children trailing behind parents along dusty paths. Each fragment carries echoes of these movements, faint but enduring. Archaeology teaches us that the humblest objects often outlast the grandest. Stone temples may crumble, but their outlines can be rebuilt. Written records may decay, but their impressions can be copied. A sandal, however, leaves behind what feels like breath itself, fleeting, fragile, yet deeply human. When we see hardened reeds that once bent with each step, we are reminded of the texture of life that is often lost in history's telling. The ordinary moments of putting on shoes in the morning, walking across earth, removing them at day's end. These traces also remind us of resilience. Sandals, woven from reeds and palm fronds, were never meant to last millennia. They were designed for a season, perhaps two, before they frayed and needed repair or replacement. That any remain at all is a quiet miracle of preservation, the right mixture of dryness, soil, and shelter protecting what would normally vanish. Each surviving sandal is a voice of that should not have been heard across time, yet it speaks. In archaeological reports, the descriptions are often plain measurements of fibers, notes on braiding patterns, sketches of imprints. Yet between the lines lies something more than data. There lies the realization that someone, thousands of years ago, sat in a courtyard and made this very braid, this very strap, this very sole. Their hands guided the fibers, their patience shaped the weave, their need gave purpose to the craft. Archaeology restores not only the object, but also the gesture. To imagine sandals uncovered in excavation is also to imagine the soil that once covered them, the compacted dust of abandoned homes, the ash of fires long extinguished, the silt left by floods of the great rivers. Each layer of earth tells a part of the story, and the sandals found within them belong to those contexts. A sandal hardened in clay tells of a flood that washed it there. A leather scrap blackened by ash tells of fire. Each remnant carries both life of its wearer and the circumstances of its preservation. And so, archaeology is not only discovery but also interpretation. A single sandal fragment cannot speak alone. It must be understood alongside others. Archaeologists compare the fibers, note the twists, identify the reeds, and in doing so, reveal patterns. How sandals were made differently in one town than another. How styles shifted over centuries, how materials changed with seasons of abundance or scarcity. Through sandals, they see social history written in fibers rather than ink. Museums hold these finds quietly. Behind glass, a fragment of reed sandal rests in controlled air, its fragility preserved against further decay. Visitors may walk past quickly, their eyes caught by larger statues or golden treasures. Yet those who pause find in the sandal something more intimate than grandeur. The touch of everyday life, the closeness of human footsteps across time. The fragment becomes a mirror, reminding us that the story is not only the story of rulers but also of those who rose each morning, slipped on their sandals, and walked out into the day. In this way, archaeology of sandals becomes archaeology of humanity itself. Each imprint is a trace of presence, each fragment a link to the countless lives once lived quietly and fully, nor remembered through what remains. And though the sandals are silent, they speak more gently than any inscription. They remind us that life is always lived step by step, and that even the humblest step leaves a mark. To study sandals in archaeology is to study traces of walking through fields, through streets, through sacred spaces, and to realize that those who walked before us are not so distant after all. Their sandals, worn and frayed, endure as witnesses, carrying the rhythm of ancient footsteps into the present. And so, as night deepens and we imagine archaeologists working by lantern light, carefully lifting fragments from soil, we may close our eyes and hear those footsteps again, faint but steady, across dust and clay, across millennia. They walk beside, useful, quiet companions in the long journey of history. Though centuries have passed, the idea remains simple: to take what is close at hand, to weave fibers into something useful, something that carries us forward. The sandals of Mesopotamia are gone now. Their reeds and leathers returned to dust, but the craft has never truly vanished. Instead, it lingers in echoes across cultures and centuries, like a thread that binds the past quietly to the present. In villages far from the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, people continued to braid grasses into soles, to twist fibers into straps, to soften leather with oil until it bent easily around the contours of the foot. In distant lands, the form changed, but the purpose remained. Protection for the journey, comfort in movement, a steady companion for every step. In Japan, woven straw sandals called waraji once carried peasants along narrow mountain paths. In Africa, leather thongs bound feet against the hot earth, simple yet enduring. In the Mediterranean, rope sandals pressed their patterns into sand and soil. These variations, scattered across geography, remind us that the quiet solution of weaving a sandal was not limited to one place or one people. It was an answer born again and again, wherever human beings met the ground with bare feet and sought to ease the journey forward. The legacy of Mesopotamian sandals, then, is not only in what remains in archaeology, though fragments of reed and leather whisper from the soil. It is also in this repeating gesture, this shared inheritance of craft, to take what grows near water, or what comes from herds, to cut, braid, and tie, to fashion protection for the journey. This is a rhythm as old as humanity itself. And so, when we look back at the sandals of Mesopotamia, we see more than an artifact. We see the beginning of a long, unbroken thread of practical creativity, a legacy that hums quietly beneath the larger songs of history. Kings built monuments, empires rose and fell, but sandals endured in their modest purpose. They walked across dusty paths, across markets filled with grain, across temple courtyards where worshippers bowed their heads. They carried farmers to fields and merchants to stalls. They carried children in play and elders in slow, careful steps. Their memory lingers not because of grandeur, but because of simplicity. A sandal, woven patiently by hand, represents resilience, the ability to adapt to seasons, to wear and repair, to continue step after step. It represents care, the attention of hands smoothing fibers, of parents teaching children, of families gathering in courtyards to prepare reeds at dusk. It represents community, the market where sandals were traded, the temple where they were removed in reverence, the shared ground pressed by countless souls. Even today, when shoes are made in factories by machines, their forms echo those first sandals. Straps cross the foot as they did thousands of years ago. Soles bend and flex, just as reeds once did. Even fashion, in its endless reinvention, returns again and again to simplicity. Sandals of rope, sandals of leather, sandals woven of straw. They remind us of something ancient, something deeply human. The act of slipping on sandals is, in its way, a continuation of Mesopotamian memory. When we walk in sandals now, on beaches or in gardens, we walk not so differently than those who once moved through the clay streets of yore or the fields along the Euphrates. The gentle legacy of sandals is also found in Thiwe. They remind us to look not only at what is grand in history, but at what is ordinary, for it is often theodinary that endures most deeply. Temples may crumble, palaces may sink into ruin, but the memory of daily life, the sandals, the pots, the baskets remains, woven into human culture. They show us that history is not only written by rulers or etched into stone, but carried in the hands and feet of ordinary people. Each worn soleless a page of that story, each repaired strap another line. To honor this legacy is to honor the quiet resilience of lives lived not in conquest or power, but in steady endurance. When we picture Mesopotamia, we often imagine grandeur of ziggurats against the horizon, the vast stretch of canals, the bustling markets filled with barley and dates. Yet somewhere in every one of those scenes was the sandal, on the feet of laborers climbing steps, on the feet of scribes walking into temples, on the feet of children following their parents home at dusk. Sandals steed those larger images to the ground, reminding us that behind every grand structure was the simple act of walking, the simple need to protect the foot from dust and stone. In this way, sandals become a symbol of perspective, a reminder that the great and the small are always intertwined. The ziggurat was climbed by feet in Sandals. The harvest was gathered by hands that also repaired straps at night. The market thrived because sandals carried people there at dawn. Without sandals, the rhythm of life would have faltered. Their legacy lies in Bingbeth, indispensable and overlooked. Archaeology gives us fragments, but imagination lets us restore them. When MC hardened reeds in a museum case, we may close our eyes and picture them as they once were, supple, fresh from the riverbank, still smelling of water and green growth. We may imagine the hands that bent them, the courtyard filled with evening light, the quiet concentration of weaving. We may imagine the first time their sandals were worn, their soles pressing into damp clay, leaving imprints that dried in the sun. We may follow those footsteps through days of labor, through markets at dawn, through sacred thresholds. We may feel the wear of time, the straps loosening, the soles thinning, the careful repairs made with patience. We may imagine Thephanal rest, the sandals left behind, buried by chance, only to be uncovered centuries later. In this act of imagination, we continue the legacy, not by wearing the original sandals, but by carrying their memory into the present. And so the legacy is gentle but profound. It tells us that usefulness can be beautiful, that simplicity can endure, that what carries us through our days may also carry our memory across millennia. It teaches us humility, that greatness is not only in monuments, but in objects humble enough to be worn and repaired. It teaches us connection, that we share across cultures and ages the same needs, the same solutions, the same rhythms of life. It teaches us continuity, that though times change, the act of weaving, the act of walking, the act of making something with care binds us together. As dusk falls over this chapter of history, Imagine once more the quiet of Mesopotamia, a courtyard in fading light, the day's labor done, sandals resting by the hearth. Outside, the river flows as it always has, carrying silt and memory alike. Stars begin to appear, and in their silent watching, the sandals seem almost eternal. They remind us that history walks beside us, not only in grand echo but in the soft tread of ordinary lives. And though the sandals themselves may be gone, their legacy endures in every woven shoe, in every repaired strap, in every step we take across the earth. They are with us still, gentle companions of time. When we reach the end of this long walk through the story of sandals, we find ourselves not so much at a conclusion, but at a gentle resting place, a pause in the rhythm of footsteps that have stretched across centuries, from the first reeds cut along the banks of Mesopotamian rivers to the last fragments unearthed in dusty excavations. The story of sandals has been one of simplicity, patience, and endurance. Unlike the grand narratives of kings and battles, unlike the towering monuments that declare power across the ages, sandals speak in a quieter voice. They remind us that history is not built only by the mighty, but also by the ordinary, by those who wove reeds at dusk, by those who repaired worn souls by the light of oil lamps, by those who carried baskets to market in the cool hours of dawn. The legacy of sandals is, in its way, the legacy of humanity itself, humble, enduring, and always moving forward step by step. We began by looking at the materials, the reeds and fibers gathered by hand, softened, split, and smoothed until they could bend without breaking. From those first strands came the souls, braided patiently into firm spirals that could withstand hot ground or damp fields. Then came straps, woven of leather or cord, tied across the foot with a snugness that was both practical and elegant. Each part of the sandal was small, yet each reflected hours of labor and the touch of many hands. These were not tools of power or symbols of wealth, though some were decorated or stitched more finely than others. They were companions, objects that walked with people in daily life, carrying them across fields, markets, and temples. This ordinariness is what makes them extraordinary now, for in their ordinariness we glimpse what was most constant and shared. In ancient life, we saw how sandals shifted with the seasons, becoming lighter in spring, sturdier in harvest, thicker in winter, and always adapting to the rhythm of the year. We saw them laid out in markets at dawn, traded alongside mats and baskets, never with grandeur, but always with necessity. Where followed, their footprints pressed into dust and clay, washed away by wind and rain, yet telling silent stories of movement and gathering. We saw them even in sacred spaces, where worshippers left them at thresholds, acknowledging that the act of walking, the act of touching earth, carried meaning into the divine. And watched how the craft was passed down to children, how small hands practiced knots and braids under the watchful eyes of elders, learning not from books or inscriptions but from repetition, patience, and laughter. In all these moments, sandals appeared not as lifeless objects, but as participants in the rhythm of daily life. We also considered the truth that sandals wore out, soles frayed, straps broke, but nothing was wasted. They were repaired again and again, mended until they could no longer hold. Each repair was part of the story, each stitch another marker of endurance. In this we glimpse a wisdom too easily forgotten today, that usefulness is not discarded, but extended, that wear is not failure, but history. Sandals were not designed to last forever, yet they endured long enough to walk with people through fields, markets, homes, and temples, and then to rest in the earth until archaeology brought them to light once more. Their fragments read impressions. Scraps of leather remind us that the smallest and humblest objects can become the most faithful witnesses of time. Social roles found their way into sandals too. Farmers wore simple woven soles, officials perhaps leather with careful stitching, merchants sandals with slight adornment. Yet even in these differences, sandals softened the boundaries between people. They were not crowns or jewels that shouted wealth. They were necessities, shared by all, reminding us that the act of walking, the act of needing protection from the earth, was universal. This universality is part of their gentle legacy. When we look at the traces left behind in excavations, sandals shardened by time, soles pressed into ancient clay, we are reminded that what endures is not always the grand but the humble. A frayed strap tells us as much about ancient life as a tablet of law. A worn sole reveals as much about daily journeys as a king's inscription. The sandals whisper that history is not only about rulers and conquests, but also about the countless, unrecorded lives that moved quietly through time. And now, in our own age, when sandals are still made and worn around the world, their form carries echoes of Mesopotamia. Rope sandals on beaches, leather thongs in summer, straw shoes in fields, all are part of the same long thread. They remind us that the most enduring human inventions are often the simplest. To cover the foot with a flexible sole, to bind it with straps, to walk more easily across the earth, this idea has outlasted empires, languages, and dynasties. It is not a relic of the past, but a continuity into the present. The gentle legacy of sandals is, above all, Allison in perspective. It asks us to remember that history is not only in monuments, laws, and battles, but also in objects worn thin by daily use. It asks us to honor the labor of hands that braided reeds and softened leather, the patience of those who taught children, the endurance of those who repaired what was broken. It asks us to value simplicity not as lack, but as resilience, as continuity. Sandals remind us that what carries us forward need not background to be meaningful. As we close, let us imagine once more the quiet of ancient Mesopotamia, dawn light on reed-filled riverbanks, the sound of sandals shuffling across clay streets, the soft murmur of markets beginning, children in shaded courtyards, practicing knots, farmers walking home at dusk, worn sandals tied together with repairs, worshippers leaving sandals at temple thresholds. All of these small moments, bound together, form a history just as rich as that of kings and empires. Sandals are its gentle thread, never shining, never commanding attention, but always present, always carrying lives forward. And so we end, not with a monument, but with a simple truth, that the humblest objects, like sandals, are sometimes the most enduring companions of humanity. They are reminders that history is not only written in stone, but also in footsteps across dust and clay. They are proof that usefulness and beauty can exist quietly, without grandeur. They are symbols of continuity, or patience of endurance. They are, in the end, the gentle legacy of sandals.